discussion. Let's go to question number 1. Right, our question number 1. Remember, when you're answering an essay, when answering a source-based question, check the focus of the question. What is the focus of our question? It's saying, how were the lives of Berliners affected by the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961? That is the focus of our source-based question. It focuses on how the lives of the Berliners were affected by the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. Right. So basically, maybe just giving you a brief history, just a reminder of the Berlin Wall. It's just a reminder. We're not concentrating onto the Berlin Wall as a particular historical aspect, because I understand the information you have it and it's at your disposal. You already know about the Berlin Wall. Right. The Berlin Wall was actually built by the East German, the German Democratic Republic, trying to prevent its people from moving from East Berlin going to the West. And why was it so that Berlin was divided into East and West? It was because of the fact that Berlin was supposed to be divided into zones of occupation, which were supposed to be occupied by the 4 superpowers after the Second World War. And on the extreme east, we tend to find that on the east, it was then a zone of occupation of Berlin, which was controlled by the USSR or Russia. Then on the west, we had the 3 superpowers having their zones of occupation there. The zone of occupation for the USA, and another zone of occupation for France, and then the last zone of occupation for the British. And ultimately, we got to discover that those 3 zones of occupation, which were controlled by the capitalistic countries, they later on united them into one zone of occupation, which meant that by that time, by around 1961, Berlin was now divided into 2. The East zone of occupation, which was controlled by Russia, and the West, which was a combined zone of America, Britain, and France. And what was happening because of the unfolding of historical events, I think you still remember the Marshall Plan. Because of the Marshall Plan, America was releasing funds to assist war-ravaged countries to recover from the implications of the Second World War. And given that the zone of occupation in the West was a zone of occupation which was controlled by capitalistic countries, it was also a beneficiary of the funds which came from the Marshall Plan. And apparently, they were now able to revive the economy of West Berlin, and the economy thrived. And also because of the combined effort of the 3 superpowers, they were now able to implement policies which were effective in managing the economies of their zones of occupation and also their territories in West Germany. So as a result, there was a distinction between East Berlin and West Berlin. The Eastern Berlin, because it was still under communism, and remember the USSR was struggling, it was not making it financially and economically. And their people now were exposed to poor living conditions because of the limitations in the financial capacity of their superpower controlling them. So there was a mass exodus of people moving from the East Berlin going to the West, which prompted the East Berlin to construct a wall to block its people from escaping from East going to the West. And remember, it was an ideological war between capitalism and communism. Both the extreme ends, they were trying to make their economic system appear pleasing to the people so that they would be able to influence other countries to follow their ideologies. So in as much as Russia was failing, they did not want also the world to know that their economic system was a failure and their very own people were actually running away or trying to find ways of running away from their own territory. That is why they had to construct a wall to block people escaping from East going to a better economy in the West. And also because of the political systems, the political governance, the government of the German Democratic Republic or the East German, it was a communist government, which was also some communist government, which was a fascist government. It was a dictatorial government which did not respect the humanity, which did not respect human rights. So people were also not happy being governed by a dictatorial and fascist government. That is why they were moving also to the West, where there was democracy under capitalism. So basically, that is the focus of our question. We want to look at how people's lives were affected by the construction of that Berlin Wall, separating East Berlin from West Berlin. Right. We are going to start with question number 1. Right. When, according to the source, did the construction of the Berlin Wall begin? Our focus here on the question, you can see, is saying when. When a question is saying when, it means it's addressing a time factor. We are worried about the time factor here. When it says when, we want to identify the time factor for which that particular historical event happened. So basically, when we're talking of when, we're talking of time, the time factor. And also, if you check the mark allocation, if you check your mark allocation here, this is a 1-by-1 question, which means this is an extraction question. It's extraction, meaning to say the answer is there in the source. What we just need to do is to go to the source and identify the answer. If you come to our source, you tend to find that our source 1A is there. And also, before you attempt questions, also check the context of the question of the source. Try to figure out the heading of the source and identify what the source is about. Like if you check the context of our source here, source 1A says, the source below is from an article, Berlin Local Life, written by D. Rhodes in the Travel Guide of 31 March 2015. It explains why the Berlin Wall was constructed in August 1961. That is the context of our source, which means the focus area of our source is explaining why the wall was constructed. Right. So the question is saying when. So we just go to the source. It's an extraction question. If we check here, it says construction on the Berlin Wall began early on the morning of Sunday, 13 August 1961. So when, this is where our response is. This happened on, it was on a Sunday, the 13th of August 1961. That is where our response is coming from. So it's an extraction question. We just extract our answer as it is from the source. So the construction, it happened on that particular day and date. Right. Give one reason in the source why the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, constructed the Berlin Wall. Again, if we check, it's a 1-by-1. This is an extraction question again, and we just want to identify one reason, which will also mean that we have to go to our source and identify where we find our response from the source. It's an extraction question, right? It says, if we check there, an effective move by the German Democratic Republic to do what? To stop East Berliners escaping from the Soviet-controlled East Germany into west of the city. That was the reason why they built that particular wall. From what we've been discussing, people were now moving away, were now escaping from east, going to the west. So they built a wall to stop East Berliners escaping from Soviet-controlled East Germany into the west of the city. And the west of the city, remember, we've mentioned that it was controlled by America, Britain, and France. And given the differences in the ideological systems that they were following, they wouldn't be pleased to have their people moving to a different economic system or to a different political ideology. So they were preventing their people from escaping from the east going to the west, which was controlled by the capitalists. Right, we move on to the next question. Right, the next question is a concept, definition of the term. It is much important that whenever we are studying, also start with your key concept, understand the key concept of the topic so that when you are answering questions, you get to be used to the terms and you get to interpret them correctly and understand their meaning. Right. When we talk of communism here, we can define it differently according to different understandings. But what is required is for you to address the basics of the definition. Right. When we're talking of a communism, we can talk of communism as an ideology. an ideology. Or we can talk of communism as an economic system. It's either an ideology or an economic system. And how does it operate? Or what are the basis for the function of such an ideology? The ideology basically it believes in collective ownership. Collective ownership, meaning to say the government has ultimate control over the state resources and is the one responsible for the distribution of the resources towards its own people. And what is the main aim under communism? The main aim is to attain equality. Equality meaning to say we want to try by all means to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor. So communist ideology is an ideology or an economic system that yes is its existence to collective ownership of property and the means of production, or resources are to be shared equally among its citizens in a particular country. And also the other basics is that the government has got ultimate control over the resources. It is the government's duty to distribute the resources, to manage production of goods and services, to manage the resources and to manage production and to manage the distribution of those resources amongst the citizens. That is the basic idea of communism, which is now different from capitalism. If we're looking at the ideology which was followed by America, Britain, and France, their ideology was that of capitalism, which is different from communism. Capitalism now on the other extreme, it does not believe in equitable distribution. It believes in reward for your effort. The more you work, the more you must get. The more you are innovative, the more you must be rewarded. That is a capitalistic ideology. So under capitalism, the belief is that we must have private ownership of the resources or the means of production. They must be owned privately, which means if you are able to do a particular business, you must be allowed to run and operate your own business and make as much profit as is possible. If you are vulnerable, then the system will exploit you to its own advantage. And that is your own disadvantage. You must be innovative enough to come out with creative ideas to sustain yourself and to be able to sustain in that particular economy. So if you're talking of communism, you have to address the basics, like what we've indicated there. Right, let's move on to the next part. We want to look at the next section or question. Right, what is it saying? It's saying, explain why you think the fleeing of people to the West in 1961 ended up damaging the following. Right, that escape, it had some form of implications on either the East or the West. Why? We are saying we want to look at the credibility of the German Democratic Republic. Its credibility as a nation governing a zone of occupation, and also want to look at its ideology, given that it was also trying to infuse its ideology into the world economies. How did it impact on its credibility? Was it still credible? Were people still believing in it? Were people still having to believe in the German Democratic Republic, given that people were running away from its zone of occupation? So if you're talking of credibility there, definitely the credibility was harmed. Its credibility was harmed. There was no way people would still behave or believe in a system which is showing failure or which is ultimately portraying its failure to the world. The system was failing because of the fact that people were running away from the system as it stood. So it meant that its credibility was harmed or it became less credible. Why? It was evident to the world that communism was not effective. The fact that people were running away from a territory which was a communist territory, it was a proof to the world that communism was a less effective method of managing resources. And also it portrayed the fact that people were not happy with communism. The fact that they were running away from communism, it was also an indication that the system was non-functional and was not working to the benefit of the people. That was why people were running away from the system. So the credibility was ultimately harmed, or the credibility was harmed and became less credible for the fact that people were fleeing away from the system. It portrayed a bad image of the German Democratic Republic, because if life was comfortable, we wouldn't have a situation whereby people would be running away from a functional system. So to the world, the credibility was harmed, or it became less credible to the world because of the fact of the exposure that communism was failing. Then if we go to the workforce of the GDR, we are looking at the productive people here. How the fleeing of the people there affected the workforce of the German Democratic Republic. Obviously, the productive workforce was lost. Here we are looking at the skilled people from the East, from the GDR. The GDR's people who were skilled, they were lost to West Germany. So basically, we are saying it lost the skilled workforce. Why did it lose the skilled workforce? There was less employment opportunities. There were less opportunities in the East. So there was massive brain drain. People were moving away for the sake of going for greener pastures on the other side, leading to critical shortage of skilled labor in the East. So the workforce was lost, and also we can talk of brain drain. It was affected negatively by loss of skilled and professional people from its side, who were opting to go to the other side where life was more productive and where there were more opportunities for them. So on the workforce was also negatively impacted. It lost the skilled workforce and also had issues of brain drain, whereby skilled people and professional people were leaving from the East going for greener pastures on the western side. Right. Then the last part of source 1D, 1B, 1A says, quote two pieces of evidence from the source, which indicates that within a day, the west of Berlin was completely sealed off from the East. We want to look for information. We want to look for evidence from the source, which suggests that it was sealed within a day, right? If we go to our source, we tend to find that there's a statement here which says, in a master flip planned operation spanning or taking just 24 hours. It is giving us a clue of a time factor of a day. It was a master flip planned operation which spanned for just 24 hours. The streets of Berlin were torn up, showing that there was now a blockade, an effective blockade. The streets were torn up, meaning to say they were no longer accessible throughout. They were now split. So this is first evidence that we can use. In a master flip planned operation spanning just or taking just 24 hours, the streets of Berlin were torn up. Or if we also come to this other end here, we also tend to find that there's also evidence. Starting from this one, it says, so that within a day, the west of Berlin was completely sealed off from the east. It's also giving us a factor of the day, or the 24-hour factor here. So within a day, the west of Berlin was completely sealed off from the east. It also shows us that it was an operation which was effectively implemented and put in place within a day's time. Everything was done as fast as was possible, and within a day's time, there was a complete wall. There was a complete blockade which was preventing people from escaping from the east going to the west. Right. So we are done with our first source, source 1A. We quickly move on to source 1B. Right. If you check source 1B, it says identify 3 incidents in the source that Hans Peters witnessed at 2 a.m. on the 13th of August 1961 while he was on border duty in the French sector of West Berlin. Right. As usual, also, you have to check the context of your source, as it is also going to help you when you're answering your paragraph question. You must gather the evidence as you go through the sources. What is the context of this source here? The source below is from a book titled The Great Power Conflict after 1945 by P. Fisher, who was a historian. It details the accounts of police sergeant Hans Peters, a hotel worker, Ursula Henman, who were eyewitnesses to the events that took place in Berlin on 13 August 1961. So these are two accounts of eyewitnesses who experienced the Berlin Wall coming into effect whilst they were in the East, and they attempted to go to the West and only to realize that there was a wall which had sealed the two extreme ends. Right. So we go to our questions. Right. Our question says, identify 3 incidents in the source that Hans Peters witnessed while he's on the border. We want to identify 3 events there. Right. Hans Peters was on the border on border duty in the French sector of West Berlin at 20 past 2 a.m. What is the first event? 6 trucks rode towards him, headlights blazing. It's one event which has happened. He's on duty on the border, and all of a sudden, there are 6 trucks which are heading towards him and with blazing headlights. Since it was early in the morning, it was still during the dark hours. Right. That is event number 1. And also, if we continue, we see that a moment later, what happened? The street was full of armed soldiers who set up machine guns, which were aiming at the French sector. It's also another event that he witnessed, the street getting filled with armed soldiers. All of a sudden, it was the trucks first, then all of a sudden, the street was filled with armed soldiers who were targeting their machine guns on the side of the French sector of the western sector of Berlin. Then we continue. We want to identify another because we want 3 events there. Which is the third event? 2 guards approached carrying coils or rolls of barbed wire. So we are seeing the unfolding of the event of blocking east from the west. The trucks are coming. It's it's still early a.m. before even, and we are seeing trucks heading towards the boundary of east and west. And those trucks, all of a sudden, the street is filled with armed soldiers who are setting up machine guns. And we also see the unfolding of the guards bringing in barbed wires, rolls of barbed wire. So it was an action-packed event of sealing off the border between the east and the west. Right, those are the 3. So the first one, trucks rolled blazing headlights, and the street was filled with armed soldiers. Then number 3, the guards approached carrying coils of barbed wire. Right, we move on to the next one. Comment on what is implied by the words, it's all over now with trips to Berlin, in the context of what happened on 13 August 1961. Right, comment on. We are saying, what is the deeper meaning of this statement here? It's all over now with trips to Berlin. It is all over now with trips to Berlin. If you are looking at it from the face value of the statement, it's meaning that the trips going to Berlin have come to an end. The trips to Berlin have come to an end. We are in the East, and we are hearing this statement from the East that it's all over now with trips to Berlin. Meaning to say, there was no more trip to Berlin. Or it apparently meant that the way to Berlin was now blocked. Or it meant that it was somehow illegal for one to be allowed to move freely from East going to the West. So if we check the context of our source here, where do we get the statement? Let's try to figure out sense from where the statement is. Our statement is here. It's all over now with trips to Berlin. Right. Let's check the context from the paragraph. It says at 4:45 a.m., Ursula Henman awoke in her East Berlin flat to another working day at the Plaza Hotel in West Berlin. She walked to a nearby station and went to the ticket counter. No, take your fannings, which is money, back. It's all over now with trips to Berlin. We are seeing an eyewitness here who was trying, he was not trying rather, it was he had normal routine to wake up from the east going to the west for work. She was a hotel worker. She was intending to go to her work as early as 4:45 in the morning. But all of a sudden, she's going to the station to purchase a ticket to get her ride to the west. And on the counter, she's being told that, no, 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 take back your money. It's now over with trips to Berlin. So what is the meaning of that? So definitely it means that she could no longer go to the west. If you are to look at it from a literal perspective, she could no longer, it meant that no one could no longer be allowed to go to the west. Or normal trips or normal rides to the west were ultimately banned. Or it was now illegal for one to freely move from the east going to the west. Rather, it was impossible for one to go to the west. That's the meaning of, because if you are seeing someone trying to purchase a ticket for a route that they fly almost every day, going to work, and all of a sudden, they're now being told that it's over with those trips. What's the meaning of that? So that is how you attempt that particular question. Let's move on to the next question. Explain why a historian would regard this source as reliable when researching an account of what transpired in the morning of 13 August 1961. But when I check on reliability, remember reliability we are saying, is it the truth? Can we trust this? That is reliability. Can we trust this? So can we trust whatever we get from that source? We were not there on the 13th of August 1961, but we want to have a clear and cleaner picture of what happened. Can we trust whatever we are told there? What do we have to check to guarantee ourselves that this is the reality of what happened on that particular day, or this is the truth of what actually happened on that particular day, or this is what we can completely trust as historians as of that particular event of the 13th of August 1961. Right. So what we need to check there, when you're talking on reliability, check on the basic aspect of the nature of the source. Check on the type of the source. What kind of a source is that one? We are told that it's an eyewitness. Those are two people were eyewitnesses. The hotel worker and that particular other guy, they were eyewitnesses who were actually willing to come from the east going to the west to their workplaces. So we can safely rely because we have eyewitnesses in that particular source. We have experiences of eyewitnesses who were ultimately affected by that blockade, that wall blocking the east from the west. So having eyewitnesses, it means that we can rely on that source. And also, check also the author of the source. Who produced the source? Can we rely on, this is a source from a book, The Great Power Conflict After 1945 by P. Fisher. And who was he? Was a historian. We're more likely to rely on sources produced by historians or people skilled in the field of history, professionals in the field of history. They are more likely to give us reliable sources than people who are new in the field or people who are not even professionals in the particular field. So we can safely rely that this is the truth of what happened, or this is the actual thing that we can trust about that particular event because of the author, who is a historian, and also because of the source having eyewitness experiences in that particular event of the Berlin Wall. Right, move on to the next question. Go on to the next question here. Right. This is a comparison question. And remember, you must follow instructions when you are answering a comparison question, or whichever way is a contrast or is a comparison. You must always follow instructions. You compare the two sources, like source 1A, yes, this information, which is supported by source 1B, which has got this information. That is how you compare sources. And that is going to give you 2 marks. You identify one aspect in source 1A, which is supported by an aspect in source 1B. What are we saying when we talk of support? We are saying which is similar. Something in source 1A, which is similar to what is in source 1B. You give it as it is in source 1A, and you also portray it how it is shown in source 1B. Then you get 2 marks. And you have to find another example of something in source 1A, which is also supported with information or with a visual in source 1B. So if you check your 2 sources, we are worried about source 1A, and then you write, says this, and this is supported by source 1B, which says this. Then this is 2 marks. That is how you get your 2 marks. And then again, give another example. This is one example of what is in source 1A and what is in source 1B. You give another different example, which is going to give you the other 2 marks to make it 2 by 2, which is a total of 4. So coming back to our question, let's go to the sources so that I will highlight where we find the responses and where we get the comparison of those 2 sources. We want to compare source 1A to source 1B on the events regarding the Berlin incidents. So if we come here, if we check our source 1A, right. Source 1A, if we check them, it says the construction of the wall. What is it saying? Construction of the Berlin Wall began on the morning of Sunday, 13 August 1961. Right. This one here is talking about the construction of the wall. Construction of the Berlin Wall began early morning of Sunday, 13 August 1961. It's telling us that the wall construction started on that particular day. Do we have information which supports that the wall was actually constructed in source 1B? So we come to source 1B here. If we check in source 1B, it talks about the events which unfolded as the wall was being, the construction was commencing. These events here. At 2:20, it says trucks rolled towards him, headlights blazing, streets filled with soldiers set up with machine guns, and guards approaching with barbed wires. This is the commencement of the construction of the wall. These events that were witnessed, they were showing that they were putting into action the construction of the wall. They started by the barbed wire while the wall was being constructed. So it's supporting each other. They are saying early morning of 13 August. And here we are even told about the time. It's 2 a.m. That was when this person was witnessing these events happening. They are events which are showing that the construction of the wall was commencing. The coming of the trucks, the filling of the streets by soldiers, and the guards bringing in barbed wire. So they are corresponding there. It's one evidence that you can use. Then again, you go to the source 1A, identify some other aspect there, which you also find in source 1B. Right. It says here, East Berliners were completely, it says, East Berliners were blocked from escaping to the West. If we check in this source, we have information that the East Berliners were completely sealed from the West. Right. It says, I've controlled me to, it says 1,500 fleeing to the West, damaging both credibility. No, master planned operations spanning 24 hours. Streets were, right, crucial places, subways. Within a day, the west of Berlin was completely sealed off from the east. The west of Berlin was completely sealed off from the east. This statement here, it's showing us that west was no longer accessible from the east. Where do we get another supporting statement? Here. This statement which is saying it's all over now with trips to Berlin. They are supporting each other. This one is saying the west was completely sealed from the east. And this one is saying it's all over now with trips to the west, to Berlin. It means now those two are supporting each other. One is saying this one is completely sealed off, and this one is saying it's now all over, which means there's no more movement to the west. And also, if we check the experience of Ursula, it talks about here, what did the guards bring? Right. If we check source 1A, it says west completely sealed. And in source 1A, we are told of those particular events which unfolded as that guy was witnessing the events, the construction of the wall, right? Move the German Republic, which was occupied by American and British, right? If we check here, it also further explains on the blockade which took place and how it happened, right? Commuters and travelers, if you come here, East Berliners and GDR were no longer allowed to enter the west of the city, including 60,000 who had been commuters or travelers. It talks about travelers being blocked to get to the west. And also, if we check here, we have a traveler who was intending to buy a ticket and was denied the right to buy the ticket. This hotel worker here who wanted to buy a ticket over the counter to go to the west, and he had her money returned. So it's supporting each other. It's talking about commuters being blocked. Commuters were looking at those people who are mobile, who are coming from one place. Their place of work is not the same as their place of residence. They had to use a transport mode to get their transport, to get to their workplaces. So these commuters, they were blocked, 6,000 of them. And we have an experience of one commuter who was blocked there, who was intending to buy a ticket at 4:45 a.m. to go to work to the hotel plaza, but however, was denied the right to buy the ticket and had her money brought back. So that is basically how you compare those sources, identify a particular element in one source and show how it is supported in the next source. Right. So there are many examples. We cannot finish all of them. Those three, I think they are enough. We will look at other examples also as you revise, and also maybe for those who are not who were not the candidates for the particular examination. Right. We go on to question number 1.4, which is source 1C. What is the context of our source 1C? If we check our source 1C here, it says, the extract below is from a newspaper article titled Revealed, Tragic Victims of the Berlin Wall by T. Patterson for the British, the Independent newspaper, dated 12 August 2006. It highlights the East Berliners' reaction to the construction of the wall. Right. Let's go to the first question. We have seen the context of our question. Why, according to the source, was North in West Germany on the evening before the construction of the Berlin Wall? Right, we have an experience of this guy who was blocked while he was still in the west on the day of the event. So let's look for the reason why he was in West Berlin on the evening of the construction of the wall. This is basically an extraction question. Our answer are going to get it from the source. Right. It says, Siegfried North was a 22-year-old who had been separated from his family by the momentous or important, tragic, which is a sad event that took the world by surprise. Nock, an East Berliner, had been visiting relatives in the capitalist West that evening. So our reason is clear and is here. Where had he been? He had been visiting relatives in the capitalist West Berlin on that particular fateful evening. That is where we get our response. So the fact that he had visited his relatives, he was a victim of the construction of the wall, while he had not gone back to his family. So that is the reason. We get the reason from the source. We've just extracted the information. Then we move on to the next question. Right, the next question. Explain the concept capitalist in the context of West Berlin. Capitalistic We are looking at the capitalists like what we have discussed earlier on. We are looking at the ideology which was followed by the West, which allowed for private ownership of a property and the means of production. It was an ideology which was adopted by the West Berliners, which allowed for democracy. So basically, when we're talking of capitalism, we are looking at an ideology which upholds private ownership of a property and the means of production, and also it encompasses with itself democracy and also self-initiative. People who are initiative enough are the people who survive the best under a capitalistic society. So capitalism is basically the opposite of communism. In capitalism, we believe in private ownership and we believe in initiatives of people being upheld, and also we believe in human democracy and the upliftment of human rights. The number 143, why we 143 says, what conclusion can be drawn from the fact that Nock and a group were prepared to dig a tunnel of 200 yards to smuggle their families to the West? Right, if we go to the source, we want to deduce a conclusion given the proposition by these guys. Right, let's look at the second paragraph. It says, or let's go back to see how the situation was like. Like 13 August, but found it bad blocked by border police with machine guns. His only chance of contact with his wife and daughter left in the east was to wave at them across the barbed wire divide. So we are seeing the situation here. This guy has failed to see or to get into contact with his family, but he is actually seeing them. They are just across the barbed wire. They are just across the armed soldiers. But the only way to contact them was just to wave at them, while at least he could not physically contact them because he was now blocked in the west, while his family was in the east. So what was the decision given this serious situation? He decided that his only chance was to smuggle his family to the west. Now the intention was for him to smuggle the family to the west. There was no more motive for him to keep on struggling going to the east, given the situation which was there. Definitely, maybe his workplace was in the west, and some of his relatives were staying in the west. And now, for him to struggle to go back to the east, it was no longer a viable decision. For he knew well that he might not have a chance to come back to the west again. So the only chance that was there, which was meaningful and reasonable, was for him to smuggle his family to join him in the west. And how was he supposed to smuggle the family now? That was the challenge. Given the situation at the border, there was barbed wire, and there were armed police, there were armed soldiers, and also the construction of the wall was commencing. He joined a group that had started to dig a tunnel from West Berlin, Sebastianstrasse, in the rundown district of Krusebeck that aimed to break through under the wall into East Berlin Henrikenstrasse, a distance of about 200 yards. Right, so we are seeing this was an arduous task, a difficult task for this guy to join the crew which was digging tunnels under the wall, to have him get to smuggle his family from east and take them to the west, and smuggle the family, dig a tunnel over that distance to only access your family which has been blocked in the east because of the wall. Right. So the situation there, if we are seeing, if you are to deduce the situation from what we have gathered there, we are seeing that the deduction that we can make from that situation, it actually shows us that people were not comfortable to stay under the communist rule. The fact that one would sacrifice to smuggle their family and be involved in such a arduous event to take their family, it shows that people were not comfortable in staying under the communist rule. That was why they were taking those deadly steps to smuggle their loved ones to the West. So it gives us a deduction that life was not comfortable in the East. That was why people were taking those actions to have contact with their family members and their other colleagues from the other side. And also, if we check, given the situation that he was faced with and the sacrifice that he was making, we can also make a deduction that there was no democracy in the East. Because of the governance that was there in the East, we had a communist government in the East that disrespected human rights. It was also politically unstable for people to keep staying in the East, for their rights were not recognized and were not realized as humanity. And also we check that the nature of the government was a dictatorial government. So people were not comfortable in staying in the East. That is why they were making those sacrifices of digging those tunnels as a way of finding an escape route to the West. And also, if we can check, basing on economic argument, we can also argue that the economy of the East was bad. It was poorly performing. The fact that quite a number of commuters were stuck trying to go to the West, it implies that most people were working in the West. They were just there in the East for residence purposes. It was their residential place, but their economic place was at the West, which will mean that it's a clear indication. If we are to analyze it on that perspective, it means that the economy of the East was providing very limited opportunities. People were gainfully employed in the West and had to travel or had to commute from the East going to the West. That was why that guy had to sacrifice to dig a tunnel to smuggle his family, because the economy was poorly performing. The living standards were poor in the East and they were better in the West. That is why he had to sacrifice to take his family to a greener pasture in the West. So you can argue based on the political system which was in place, the communist ideological system, how it was functioning, and also how the distribution of resources was like. Then you can also argue on it on an economic basis. And it portrays that the economy of the West was the best, while the one of the East was the West. So no one would sacrifice to stay under West conditions, while the better conditions are just across the barbed wire or across the wall. That was why people had to sacrifice to that extent of digging tunnels to smuggle their family members to the other side of the wall. Right, we move on to next question. Right, and also remember, this is a 2-by-2 question. You must give 2 different responses answering to the question. And they must be different responses, not to repeat the same response. If you can argue on political basis, argue on the political basis, but give a distinct political challenge which was posed by the communist government. Like you can talk of the government being a fascist government, which was lawlessness, which had lawlessness and which did not respect the rights of people. Or you can argue on the leadership of the government, which was a dictatorial government, which was not elected democratically and which was against the will of its own people. Or you can argue on the economic front by arguing on living conditions in the East. Or you can argue on availability of opportunities in the East. They were all limited, which meant that it gave people the age to want to move to the West. Right, we go to number 143. 143, yes, we've answered that one. 144 says, how, according to the source, was the East German or the Stasi, the secret police, able to deal with the following after the tunnel diggers had completed their work? Right, this is an extraction question. I think you can check. If you check here, this is 1 by 1. This is 1 by 1 again and 1 by 1, which means we don't need to struggle to find the responses to those questions because it's a level 1 question, which is an extraction question. The response is already provided in the source. So we want to look at how this secret police managed to deal with this guy North and his friends who were assisting him also with a group of other colleagues in digging the tunnel, and also his wife. How were they treated by the secret police? Right. We go to the source. We check where we find information about North. Right, it's written here. North, one of the first out was instantly machine gunned to death. That is where our response is. Clear as it is in the text, what was done to him? He was instantly machine gunned to death. I think you understand the situation at the border. The border police had got machine guns and were not tolerating any person trying to escape. Once they would come across you trying to escape in whichever dimension or using whichever method, they would either arrest you, but if you are beyond reach of arrest, they would machine gun you to death. So this guy was unfortunate. Being the first person to escape from the tunnel, was shot dead by the machine gun. That was what happened to him. Then what about his colleagues? Let's also check on the colleagues, part item number B. Right, if we check in the source here, we are seeing there is a section which is talking about the colleagues here. His colleagues were arrested and put on trial for undisputed provocation. That was what was done to his colleagues. They were arrested and they were put on trial for undisputed provocation. What we call undisputed provocation, we are saying they were arrested for challenging the state. The state is saying, people in the East, you must not escape going to the West. And then you try to escape. It means you are directly challenging the orders of the state. So they were arrested for that criminal act of challenging the state's directive of not allowing people to go to the West. Right. And then lastly, we want to check about his wife. What also happened to the wife? If we check going down with our source, we are told that unbeknown to the tunnel diggers, Jagen Henning, a state mole or a spy, had joined the group early on and had kept the East Berlin authorities fully informed of their activities, which meant these guys, while they were digging the tunnel, they were just digging, but not knowing that amongst them, they were spies. There was a spy guy who was sending information to the secret police that we are in the tunnel, we are digging a tunnel, and we are expecting to be out by this particular time. The progress is this much. So it was unknown to an ordinary tunnel digger that they were having a spy amongst them. So the spy had already informed the secret police, who were already waiting for these escapees trying to find their way into the West. So information about the wife, if we come to the last part of our paragraph here, it says Knox's wife was jailed in East Germany for anti-communist conspiracy. So that was what happened to the wife. So it's just extraction. You extract on the first victim, who was gunned to death. Then the colleagues were arrested and put on trial for undisputed provocation. You go to item number C. The wife was jailed in East Germany for anti-communist conspiracy, which means she was plotting also against communism. She was charged for plotting against communism. Right. That was question number 1.44. Let's go to the last source, which is source number 1D. Consult source 1D. Let's check the context of our source. It is very important that you check the context of the source to be able to figure out the direction which the source is taking you towards. Right, the cartoon below by J. Hook appeared in the Mercury newspaper in Australia on 29 August 1961. It depicts East Berlin soldiers trying to escape towards the western sector of Berlin. So that is the context of our source. And if you can see here, we can see we have these two soldiers on the front here, and the rest are like trying to fly across this physical wall here. We can see some are having some parachutes, some are having some balloons, some are having some other methods which they are trying. Some are trying to swerve themselves out of above the wall. Some are trying to spring themselves up above the wall. They are trying all means of escape as it is portrayed in this particular cartoon here. And these only two are the ones who are on the front end. They have this caption here: the men are becoming more jumpy as the Berlin crisis deepens, comrade. This caption here is also a meaning that we need to deeply investigate into and figure out the deeper meaning of that particular caption. And also there is this, if you check there's this poster here above the wall, which says, "Attention, Western sector defectors welcome." This is a poster which is put on the wall and which is from the Western side, which is promoting a defection from the East. The Western side is welcoming defectors who are willing to join the West, as it is portrayed by this a poster that we can see there. And also there's this written information which says the wall was constructed with genuine communist block for the protection of the good communists. So this writing is on the side of the communist side, on the communist bloc, which is the Eastern Berlin, and is trying to portray the wall as having positive intentions towards the communist people. He's saying for the protection of good communists. Protection, but that is propaganda. You cannot protect someone from inside. How would you build a wall to protect someone who is already inside? The danger here is not people coming from the West getting to the East, but the danger is of people coming from the East going to the West. So it means it was a prison, because the only protective wall that you can have, which protects from inside, is a prison. So the deeper meaning of this one here, it deeply means that people were imprisoned against their own will. But the intention here is propaganda when they are saying to protect the good communists, because we cannot build a wall to protect people from inside. We protect people from what comes from outside, not what is inside, because the people are already inside. So the rationale of that wall is restricting people against will of movement and free movement across from east to west. But however, this is propaganda where you see them portraying the wall as a genuine wall which was built with the intention of protecting the good communists. Right. So basically, if we have interpreted the cartoon like that, it means now we are able to figure out and use the information to answer the questions, because we have deduced the deeper meaning of the cartoons and we have seen the hidden meaning of the literal meaning of what the cartoon is trying to portray. Right, let's go to the question and try to answer the questions as fast. Question number 151 says, explain whether you would consider the words, "The men are becoming more jumpy as the Berlin crisis deepens, comrade," to be an appropriate caption for the cartoon. Right, is this caption appropriate? Let's check who drew the cartoon, who's the cartoonist here. We will be able to figure out if that cartoon is a mockery or it's a genuine statement which is supposed to be there on that cartoon, that caption there. The cartoon below by J. Hook appeared in the Mercury newspaper in Australia on August 29, 1961. To which side was Australia biased? We tend to find that Australia was biased towards the capitalistic world. So there was no way Australia would produce a cartoon, an Australian cartoonist would produce a cartoon which supports communism and publish it in a local newspaper in Australia, because Australia was a pro-capitalist. So this caption here, it's a mockery. We cannot say this caption here is a caption which is appropriate for that cartoon. Those words there, they are inappropriate. They are a mockery. They are exposing the failures of communism. Because if they are saying the men are becoming more jumpy as the Berlin crisis deepens, one, they are showing that people are escaping. People are jumping. They are becoming more jumpy. A lot of people are jumping over the wall. And in that instance, we are looking at security forces. The ones who are supposed to be protecting people from escaping are the ones who are jumping, who are now jumping across the wall. So it's exposing the failures of communism. And also, it talks about as the Berlin crisis deepens. The crises are deepening, which means there is now extreme two sides between the West and the East, giving serious challenges of people wanting to escape. So this cartoon here, this caption that was put on the cartoon is basically an inappropriate caption for that cartoon. It's a mockery for that instance. We would get that deduction from the cartoonist. If it was a cartoon by a pro-communist, the caption was going to be positive and was going to hide the failures of communism. But this one is apparently exposing the failures of communism by portraying people jumping and by portraying also the security forces jumping across the wall and using those different forms of techniques and tactics to try to jump the wall. That cartoon actually also is exposing how people were deploying the different methods to try to find their way across the wall to the West. Right. Then number 152, comment on the implication of the message on the signpost on the Western sector side. Defectors welcome. Right, this one here, I think we've deduced that before we even answered the question. Right, this one here, what is the meaning if they are saying defectors welcome? Western sector defectors welcome. Right, it means the Western side was promoting people to escape from the East to the West. If you are welcoming someone who is escaping from the other side, it means you want them to escape in large numbers and you want them to come and seek refuge in your own territory. So the West, it means the West was prepared to accommodate the refugees from the East. If they are saying Western defectors are welcome, it means they were in a capacity, they were having a capacity to take as many refugees from the East to their own side. And also, what's the other deeper meaning? They wanted to promote more people to escape. They wanted more escapees from the East going to the West because they were welcoming them. And also, we can say they wanted to portray communism as a failure to the world. So it has a meaning that they wanted to ultimately see to it that there were more people who were escaping. More people were supposed to escape. They wanted more escapees because they were welcoming them. And they wanted to take them as refugees in their own territory. They had capacity to contain those people who would escape from the East going to the West and keep them as refugees in their own zone of occupation. And also they wanted to promote their ideology of capitalism. They were welcoming people on their side so that people would believe in the end that capitalism is good, is facilitating the transition of or the movement of people from the bad side to the better side. And at the same time, they wanted communism to appear bad to the world, to look bad. By welcoming people from the other side, they wanted the world to know that life was not comfortable for people in the East. Therefore, they were willing to assist those people by having them seek refuge in their own territory. Right. That's the meaning of that sign that you are seeing on the wall of the side of the East, on the West. Right. We'll move on to the next question. What conclusion can you draw from the body language of the two generals in the foreground in the context of defections that were taking place? Right, let's look at those guys, the generals in the foreground. How are they, what kind of body language are they showing? Right, those are some of the techniques that you should encompass when interpreting cartoons. Be able to figure out the body language. We are seeing this guy here. He's stretching out his hands. This one general here is stretching out his hands. And this one is holding a weapon, but he's putting his hands in the pockets. What kind of body language is this one? If someone is stretching out their hands and someone is even putting their hands in the pockets while it's on duty, it gives a deeper meaning that these guys were tired of what they were doing. You end up working, you're supposed to be doing a physical guard of the wall, but you end up guarding while your hands are in the pocket with your weapon strapped by your armpit. It shows that these guys were actually tired of their job. And also it gives an impression that they no longer had power to control whatever was happening there. They no longer had sufficient power to control the escapees. If you end up putting your hands in the pocket while you're supposed to be doing physical work, it means you are now out of control of the situation. So these guys were also out of the control of the situation there, A lot of people were now escaping. Even their own fellow workmates were also escaping. So those generals, they were now powerless in terms of control of the level of escapee from the east to the west. And also to them, we can see, if we can also see how they are portrayed here, it also shows that in their discussion there, it is proving that communism has failed to them. Even though they are working under that ideology, but deep inside them, we can see that these guys, how they are portrayed here, they are also seeing to themselves that they are trying to defend a system which is non-functional. They are just trying to defend a system which is not working even for themselves. So if you check on those figures, that is the deduction that we can make based on the body languages that are portrayed on those guys, the two generals on the foreground on the cartoon. Right. And if we check again, let's go to the next question. This is the conclusion of the body language of those two. Right. Then we'll go to a paragraph question. I'll give you the basics of answering a paragraph question. Then we just try to figure out how we can quickly answer that one. Remember, when you're answering the paragraph questions are answered the way you answer the way you write your paragraphs in the essay. We follow the same format of the P.1 format, which is P for point, and it's P for point, and E for explanation, and E for example, and your L for the linking statement. So you must address your paragraph in these four dimensions. They must be available in your paragraph. Failure to produce this, your paragraph will get a lower rating in terms of the level of attempt that you would have done. Because remember, paragraph questions are level 3 questions, which require synthesis of information. It's not as level 1 where you extract information. And much of the learners, the problem that they do is they tend to take it as a level 1 or an extraction question. They target to go to the sources and extract maybe 8 examples from the sources. They are only dealing with evidence here because it's example/evidence. You have not answered the question. You have only used the evidence to answer the question, which means you have answered it at level 1. You have just extracted the information already given to you in the sources. So you get a maximum of 2 out of 8 if you just go to the sources and extract information from the sources, because you have not followed the structure of a paragraph, which starts with a point, you go to an explanation, then you give evidence, and then you can only link. And also, if you check how our question is phrased, it says, using information in the relevant sources, which means out of the 4 sources, we might have other sources which are irrelevant to the question, which are not answering the question. And use your own knowledge. Then if you just go to the source and take information from the source, you haven't used your own knowledge. There's no synthesis of information, which means it's either a level 1 or a level 2. Level 2 you can get from 3 out of 8 to maximum 5 out of 8. That is if you have put something in your own words, or that is if you have addressed maybe a point for that paragraph, but you fail to give convincing evidence to support what you are saying. So let's avoid losing marks. Let's follow the structure of the paragraph and try to attempt to address the basic requirements of the paragraph. So our point here, it says explaining how the lives of the Berliners were affected. That is where our question is. We want to explain how the lives of the Berliners were affected. So in our point, we should highlight the general effect on the lives of Berliners. Were they affected positively by the war, or they were affected negatively? That is the question that we must address there. Because we want to explain how the lives of the Berliners were affected. We know if it's an effect, it comes as a positive effect or it comes as a negative effect. So in this instance, we need to take a point, or we need to take a line of argument which is answering the question and which is giving direction of the paragraph. So in this instance, given the background that we have from the study of the Berlin War, and also given the evidence that we have from the sources, we can argue that the Berliners were negatively affected. Berliners were, to a great extent, negatively affected, or were greatly negatively affected by the construction of the Berlin Wall. We should focus our attention on the negative implication because we know that the lives were affected negatively based on the evidence that we have. So your opening statement must answer the question and must give us the implication on the lives of the Berliners. Were they positively affected or were negatively affected? In this instance, our line of argument, we take a negative line of argument. The Berliners were negatively affected by the construction of the wall. Then we go to explanation. Here we are explaining in your own words. You're not using the evidence in the sources. Could be killed by bullets fired by black South Africans and black Cubans. So we are saying psychologically, because of the shackles of apartheid, black people were made to believe that, specifically black Southern Africans, given the situation that they were faced with because of the apartheid government, they got to the extreme extent of believing that it was not possible for a black man to kill a white person. Or even if you shoot using a gun, shooting a white man, if you were a black man, they had the mentality that it was not possible to kill a white man. But because of the Battle of Quito Carnival, black Africans got to see that it was possible to kill a white man. So what was the implication of that? We want to find a deeper meaning of that statement, that it was important in Southern Africa that white Africans could be killed by bullets fired by black Africans or black Cubans. If we are to comment on South Africans, we can comment it as it was a wake-up call for black South Africans to realize that it was possible for them to remove the apartheid government. Because the moment they would realize that it was possible for them to attack a white man and be able to kill them, then it was a wake-up call for them to realize that it was still possible for them to overthrow the apartheid government. And also, if you are to comment on it, on general Southern Africans, it was also very important for the Southern Africans to realize that their independence was possible. Their domination by whites could come to an end at a particular point in time. Because given that they now had the mentality that we can fight against the white people and be able to kill and defeat them, now they had the confidence that it was possible for them to win their independence against suppression of the whites. And also, if you can check there, we can also see that white domination was only a psychological belief. Black people, it was important for them to see that white domination was only psychological, not physical. They were trying to manipulate the minds of black people into believing that they were unchallengeable. But however, it was only in the minds of black people to accept that the whites could not be challenged and could not be physically fought with. So now the black people got to realize that it was only in their minds that they thought they would not fight against a white man and win him. It was now possible given that they had a test of them defeating the whites. So it now became like it now acted as a consciousness amongst the black people to realize that it was still possible for them, despite the long suppression that had taken place in their lives. But it was still possible for them to still fight against the whites and be able to win a particular battle. Because if we check the suppression that had happened in South Africa specifically, we saw the apartheid government coming into action in 1948 when the National Party government was elected into office and they started implementing those apartheid laws. So from 1948 to around 1980s, that was a very big time frame of history of suppression, over 40 years of suppression. For most of the Africans, they were now having a negative mind, or they were now having a sense of self-pity for themselves. They were no longer believing that at a particular point in time, they would be able to rule over the white person. But however, because of that battle, it was also very important for them to realize that it was only in their minds that it was impossible for them to fight against the whites and be able to defeat them. Right, we go to the next question, which is question number 2.1.5. Right, we have talked about limitation, and I think I've indicated that if we check the context of this source, there is an evidence of limitation in that source. Let's go to the source and check. If we check in this context of this source, right, When you look at limitations of a source, what do you check? Right, as a reminder, you need to check who produced the source. Sources which are produced by specialists in the field of history, they are more likely to be reliable and they are less limited. They have a spectrum of coverage which is sufficient. Then you also check what is missing in that source. There is definite information that should be supplied if the source is contextualized in some perspective. If it leaves out some critical information, that source is limited. Like, for example, you talk about a battle and you don't give the results. You talk about the two fronts fighting against each other, then at the end, there are no results. That is limitation because it is not providing sufficient information to that historical aspect. Or you also need to check on bias. Bias, we are saying, is the source equally addressing the two extremes to the argument? If it is only focusing on one side, then it's limited because it has bias. Or you check on emotive language. If the source is talking of something extremely negative about the other side, that can be limitation because it has strong negative language or strong emotive language. Like if you see the capitalists labeling the communists as fascist elements, that is strong negative language. They are trying to portray the communists as extremely bad, and they are trying to portray a good image of themselves. That is also a limitation of a source. So if we check this one here, based on the author of the source, we come here, who wrote the source was by D. Goldberg, a white anti-apartheid activist. He was a white man, but was an anti-apartheid activist. Remember, there were white liberals who were fighting against apartheid. So this was one of them who was also fighting against apartheid. So the author of the source here will give us a limitation of that particular source. He is more likely to be biased towards anti-apartheid history of South Africa because he was against apartheid. That is why you saw him talking of South Africa being defeated and being humiliated until they got to a discussion table because the South African army was a white apartheid army and he was an anti-apartheid army activist. So it meant that there was no way he would talk good of South Africa in that particular war. He was talking about the good side of Angola and the good side of the Cuban forces and how they got superiority from the support that they got from USSR. But if you check on South Africa was also getting resources from America. He did not mention anything to do with America being involved on the side of South Africa. South Africa was receiving funding from America and also was receiving some equipment from America, but he never mentioned anything about that. He only focused on the side of communism because he was an anti-apartheid, was against the South Africans' involvement in Angola. So it's a limitation, that one. One, the author of the source, and also if you check, it has bias. It's more biased towards apartheid history of South Africa or Southern Africa. And also if you check, it does not accept anything good on the side of South Africa. It never told us anything good about South Africa. It just told us about South Africa getting matching and backing with the backing of the US and South Africa being humiliated in that particular battle, leading to them getting to a discussion table. So it's biased and also it has strong negative language. And also, like what he was talking of South Africans, of why it's not being unable to be killed by the blacks. And also, does not accept the good of the side of South Africa, or does not also show us the limitations on the side of the Cuban forces in Angola. Were they equally effective in the war? Didn't they have some flaws in the war? He did not mention anything. He just mentioned about Angolan superiority and everything flowing, which does not accept anything bad on that side. And also, we know the result of the war, of the Battle of Cuta-Carnavale. In this instance, he is concluding that South Africa and America were defeated. UNITA, South Africa, and America were defeated. But historically, if you were to check the history of the Battle of Cuta-Carnavale, it is agreeable from many sources that the battle ended in a deadlock. He did not mention that. He actually told that South Africa was at the verge of defeat and had to go to a discussion table to avoid humiliation. So it's also biased because it is not giving us the exact information historically from historical evidence gathered from different sources. It is agreeable that the Battle of Quito Carnival, it ended in a deadlock. No one was defeated in that particular battle. No one won the battle. But here he's talking of something different. So that source, we can critique it as a limited source based on those pieces of evidence. Right, I'll move on to the next question. Question number, right, we go to source B. Give two reasons in the source why the United States government implemented a covert plan in Angola. Why did they implement a secret plan in Angola? Right, that is an extraction question. We get the answers from the source. We got source B. Source B is here. Where do we get the information? The United States implemented a covert or secret plan, one, to crush the legitimate interests of the Angolan people. That is number one. And two, impose a puppet government. Those are the two reasons why they implemented that covert or secret intervention into Angola. Right, we go to the next one. Comment on what is implied by the statement. It was important in Southern Africa. Sorry, not this one. Explain why the United States used Mobutu and South Africa to intervene during the Battle of Quito Carnival. Right, we are seeing America not being actively involved or not being directly involved in the war, but rather using Zaire and using South Africa to get involved into Angola. So why did the USA decide to do that? Right. If we can check them, we can see from the source, we have information which is helping us understand why South Africa, why America was using those two extreme ends. Right. So it says here, right, United States aligns with South Africa to train and equip organizations created by the Portuguese colonial regime in order to frustrate Angola's independence and to turn it into a condominium or a house for Mobutu, the dictator of Congo, and South African fascism and apartheid. So what America was planning here, America wanted to frustrate the independence of Angola. They knew well that Angola was supposed to be independent if there were no disputes amongst those three liberal movements. But however, they were funding extreme division amongst those liberal movements. If they were to solve their own issues alone, they would come at an agreement in as early as was possible. They would resolve and come out with a working government. But however, the USA wanted to frustrate the independence of Angola. And also, why did they decide to use the Zaire? Zaire, remember, was already being a friend to the USA. They were befriending the USA and were receiving funding from the USA. And also, given the leadership of Mobutu, remember, Mobutu was a dictator. They wanted also to impose the same ideology in Angola so that if Angola is captured under Mobutu's control, they would also impose a leader who would follow the dictatorial rule of Mobutu and they would be able to steal resources from Angola. The same way they were benefiting from Mobutu in Zaire, they wanted to implement it in Angola by imposing a government which is a dictatorial, where people would not have a say against their own government, and the government would sacrifice its own resources for the benefit of America. And also from the apartheid South Africa, remember this was a fascism apartheid government. It was a lawless government which had disrespect for humanity, which just did whatever it wanted against the humanity of people. So they also felt if South Africa would be involved in Angola and they would introduce those fascism elements in Angola, they would also benefit from the resources of Angola. The same way the Boers were benefiting from South African resources, they wanted to implement it in Angola by involving South Africa there so that they would impose their ideology of fascism and apartheid in Angola for their own benefit. Right, we move on to the next question. 2.2.3, it talks about Comment on why Castro believed there would have been no possibility of a successful outcome in Angola without the political and logistical support from the Soviet Union. Right, we are looking at Fidel Castro, the Cuban leader. He is testifying that there would have been no possibility of a successful outcome in Angola if it was not for the sake of the USSR coming to their rescue. Right, why was he saying so? The meaning of that statement is, if we check in this source here, there is a clear indication which tells us why Fidel Castro would have said that statement. Right. It says here, although the Soviet Union was not consulted on Cuba's decision to send troops to Quito Carnival, they later decided to provide arms for the creation of the Angolan army, and they responded positively to a certain of our requests for military material support. Right. There would have been no possibility of a successful outcome in Angola without the political and logistical support from the Soviet Union against aggression of power such as South Africa from the south and Mobutu from the north. So the meaning here is Cuba had limited capacity to contain the situation. The war would have gone for a longer period because they were almost equating to each other in terms of their military strength. South Africa on the other side with UNITA and Cuba with the Angolan forces, they were almost at par in terms of their military strength, which would mean that there was not going to be progress there. The war was not going to come to an end as fast. There was need for an imbalance in the military strength so that there would be a defeated side and a winning side so that the war would come to an end. But given the situation, they were almost equally having the same military strength, and it meant that the war was going to last for very long and there was not going to be any progress in regard to the independence of Angola, given that the two extreme ends which were fighting against each other were militarily balanced. And also, if we check the Cuban forces, they also needed technical support or military support from the USSR. The Cuban government has only decided to bring in troops. That was what they did. They brought in troops to assist the Angolan forces, but however, they needed support, which was in terms of military equipment, to aid the troops which had been brought to Angola. So if it was not for the sake of the USSR bringing in those military equipments to assist that side, it would have also costed them a very long time to get to the final decision of the transition of Angola into independence. Right. The next question is talking about quote two pieces of evidence from the source that suggests why South Africa had to sit down around the negotiation table. This is an extraction question. Why did South Africa have to go to a discussion table? The overwhelming victory at Quito Carnival, especially the withering or humiliating advance by powerful front of Cuban troops in southern western Angola, put to an end outside military aggression against that country. Right. If we check these statements here, that is where we are supposed to extract our information, which is going to help us to answer the question. Why South Africa had to go to a discussion table? Right. Check the first part, the overwhelming victory at Quito Carnival. South Africa was almost threatened by the victory of the opponents. So the only way to avoid humiliation was to withdraw from the war and decide on some negotiation with the enemy. They were feeling overwhelmed by the Cuban forces, and the victory of their side of their opponents was almost definite. So there was no need for them to continue fighting, given that they were seeing it to their disadvantage that they were going to lose the war. They had to avoid humiliation and cut short the war and opt for a negotiation. And also, it says, especially the withering or humiliating advance by the powerful front of Cuban forces. It is also showing that the South Cuban forces were advancing at some pace which South Africans could not match. And definitely their win was not guaranteed in any dimension. So they had to quickly withdraw and go to a discussion table. Right, to move to the next one. The next one is talking about source C. Explain why you think this photograph was taken. Right, why is a photograph taken? I think also you need to check on the context of the photograph to get the reason why it was captured. Right, if you check the context here, it says the photograph below was taken by the United Nations photographer, J. Isaac, on 22 December 1988. It shows the representative of South Africa, United Nations, US, Angola, and Cuba. Already you have your answer here. It shows the representatives of South Africa, the UN, the United States, Angola, Cuba, signing the tripartite accord. From the context, you already have an answer because it gives you the rationale of that photograph. What is shown on the photograph is why it was captured. So it shows the representative of South Africa, United Nations, US, Angola, Cuba signing the accord. Right. You also find another usefulness or why the reason. When you check the reason why the photograph was taken, in fact, the question is in another dimension, asking you about the usefulness of that photograph. Why is it useful to have that photograph? It's the same reason why it was captured. Right. So for that one, that is the basic response that shows the members who were signing. Or the other reason you can also say it shows the coming of a new era for Angola. It was taken to show the coming of the new era for Angola because when people when those representatives came to sign the tripartite negotiation, it means they were now forging a new Angola, which was coming. So it was also captured to prove the coming of a new era for Angola, and also to signify the end to the Angolan dispute. Remember that negotiation brought to an end the dispute in Angola, and also it was where Namibia was supposed to be regarded as an independent state out of South African control. So it was very important for that matter that it also signified the end of the dispute in Angola. Right, I'll move on to the next question. Why do you think was the significance of the presence of the UN Secretary General during the signing of the Tripartite Accord? This is an African dispute involving the proxies from Europe and Asia and other superpowers, but also the United States is seen there on the signing of the negotiation and the agreement. So basically with the UN, we are talking of unity there. The UN's presence is to foster or to show unity across the world. It was to foster unity across the world. They were setting an example that it's possible that after a dispute, we can come to a discussion table and sign an agreement to end a dispute and also forge a way out from the dispute and go on with life. So the UN there is there to foster a unity amongst the world countries. Also, we can talk of fostering good faith in the signing. If UN is witnessing the signing of the agreement, later in the future, you cannot deny yourself signing. You cannot reject or you cannot go against the propositions of the agreement because you were supposed to act in good faith in the signing because it's your signing before an international organization. So it was also for the sake of promoting the parties in signing in good faith to the agreement. And also maybe the UN, we can argue that to show its commitment, to show the commitment of the UN towards a peaceful Angola or an independent Namibia. The UN being there, it shows its commitment towards bringing peace to those countries and also a peaceful transition from colonialism to independence. Right, refer to source 2A and source 2C. Comment on how the information in source 2A supports the evidence in source 2C regarding the signing of the tripartite accord. Right, this is a comparison question. We've talked about it. You look at source 2A, you find something there, and you link it to what is in source 2C. So if you go to our sources, if you check source A, it says the three-party treaty was signed. It gives us information that the tripartite was signed in 2A. If we come here, source 2A, it says here, right, the tripartite accord, the three-party treaty, or the tripartite accord that ensured Namibia's independence was signed in the New York by whoever, Angola, South Africa, and Cuba. Where do we get information in that image which supports that there is a signing of a three-party treaty or a tripartite accord? It's clearly shown in the image here. Source 2A says the signing happened, and source 2C is a visual image which shows the representative of those countries signing the treaty. So they are supporting each other. The written source is saying the tripartite was signed, and the visual is showing us the representatives signing the treaty. Then also, if we can check, in source 2A, it gives us the countries which were involved in the signing. If we check here, who signed it, it says it was signed by Angola, Cuba, and South Africa. And if you go to this source, we can actually see the representative of those countries. We have Frederick Botha for South Africa is here, representing South Africa. And who was representing Angola? Alfonso van Dumen for Angola. And also, who was representing Angola again? General Antonio dos Santos Franco was also there. And so it is supporting each other because it's giving us the countries which were involved in the signing, and also the members who were representing those countries are visible on the photograph. We can see them there. So those two sources are supporting each other, or they are corresponding to each other towards the signing of the tripartite negotiation. So that is basically how you must compare those sources. Identify an aspect in the first source and show how it is portrayed in the next source. Right, we go to the next source. Identify this in the source any two forces or parties that waged a combined attack on the Angolan MPLA during the Angolan Civil War. Right, its question is source D. We get to the source, the answer is there in the source. It is giving us that came under combined attack from South Africa, the Central Intelligence Agents, which was financing unit the FINLA, FNLA, and also the mercenaries or the guerrillas, the National Union for Total Independence of Angola, which is UNITA, the Zairian troops. So you can see there are many fronts there. You can just pick any four from those ones. We have 1, 2, 3. We have Zairian troops, 1, Angolan UNITA, 2. We have the mercenaries or the guerrillas, 3. We have FNLA, 4. We have the CIA, 5. We have South Africa, 6. So it only requires you to get any 4 from those. So those are the responses to the first part, where you can pick any 4 from the given listed fronts. Then we'll move on to the next question, which is number 2.5. Right, it says identify in the source any two forces or parties that waged a combined attack. We've done that one. Then using the information in the source and your own knowledge, comment on what is implied by the statement. By Mandela's statement, your forces in the Battle of Cuta was of truly historic significance. Your forces in the Battle of Cuta was of truly historic significance. Right, in this instance, Mandela is referring to the force which allowed Angola to become independent and be able to defeat the fascist element coming from South, apartheid, and coming from northern dictatorial Zaire, and also the support that they were getting from the USA. So if the statement is saying your forces in the Battle of Guadalcanal was of truly historic significance, we are saying it is something of historic importance to the independence of Angola or to the state of affairs in Southern Africa. It ultimately helped to shape the future of Southern Africa. Right. So if we can deduce a deeper meaning from that, because we are worried about it being of truly historical significance. It means it's of historical importance. That contribution, it's very important to the history of South Africa and Southern Africa. How was it important, or how was it of significant importance? One, it means the Cuban forces could have lost the grip without the support. If there was no support from the USSR, it was most likely that the Cuban forces were to withdraw from that particular war. So Mandela is praising the contribution which was made by the USSR in that battle, and which ultimately strengthened the side of the Angolan forces and the Cuban forces. Because without that support, it was most likely that they would have withdrawn from the war. Like if we check in our source here, there is a section which talks about the Cuban forces being overwhelmed and almost at the verge of withdrawing from the war. Right? It says, we know that the Cuban forces were willing to withdraw shortly after repelling or resisting the 1975 invasion. But the continued aggression from Pretoria made this possible. So if it was not for the support, the Cuban forces were willing to withdraw, and that was not going to reap a positive result for Southern Africa or for Angola. And also, if we can check it on that dimension, it also, the force also became a critical wake-up for apartheid South Africa government, that black people would at some point unite to overthrow them. It was of historic significance because the whites, they got to realize that it was possible for a black man to fight and win over them and overthrow their governance. So historically, they got now to discover that it was possible for the blacks to unite against them and ultimately be able to win against them. That is why, if we check the South African history, after the coming of P.1 Botha, we tend to find that he was opting for a negotiation with the blacks, because they realized that the blacks, if they get to unite against them, they would ultimately win against them, given that they were a minority group against the majority of black people. So it was also significant to the history of Southern Africa, because it acted as a wake-up call. The strength that the Cuban forces and the Angolan forces got against the whites or against the apartheid government, they got to start realizing that they do not have ultimate control over black people. If black people unite against them with the support of other countries, they will definitely be overthrown. Right, we can move on to the next one. How, according to the source, did the following respond when Mandela approached them for assistance in taking up arms? This is an extraction question. We do not need to struggle finding the response to this particular question, because this is a level 1 question. We just get the response from the question, from the source. We want the reaction. When Mandela wanted to seek assistance, he approached the Western governments and also Cuba, and their reaction were not the same. So we want to see the response from the Western governments first, and then we see how Cuba reacted. Right, so let's check for the Western governments. Right, it says here, when we wanted to take up arms, we approached numerous Western governments for assistance. And what was the reaction? We were never able to see any but the most junior ministers. That's their reaction. You want to be assisted by a government, you want senior officials from the government, then they are invisible, you can't see them. You are referred to junior ministers who do not have the capacity to make decisions. That was the direction of the West, which means they were reluctant to assist the Black Africans. They were willing to work with the apartheid government from South Africa and only work with Mobutu from the North. Right. And what was the direction of Cuba? It goes on to say, when we visited Cuba, we were received by highest officials and were immediately offered whatever we wanted and needed. So you can see that was the reaction that they got from Cuba. They were received by the highest officials, which is the opposite of what happened with the West. The West were referring them to the junior ministers, but here they were getting access to the highest officials, and they were immediately offered with whatever they wanted, whatever they needed. So that is the reaction from Cuba and the reaction from the West. So basically, it's an extraction question. We have seen where we got the answers, and the answers are in the source. Right. Explain the term internationalism. Is another term that you should familiarize with key terms. Internationalism, what historical term? Right, basically when we talk of internationalism, we are looking at political, it's basically addressing the political aspect. Internationalism, we're looking at political, and also we are looking at economic, and also we are looking at social or cultural cooperation between countries. If countries are working together on the political framework, we are assisting each other politically or solve political disputes, and we are assisting each other fight economic challenges, and also culturally we are integrating. That is internationalism. We are bonding together as one nation on an international spectrum and bringing in together a unit on the political framework, on the economic framework, and on the cultural or social framework. That is in the context of Cuban foreign policy. Cuban foreign policy was that they wanted internationalism by assisting countries to fight for their political rights. If there was a country which was exposed to political injustice, they would be willing to assist such a country to attain its political independence or to attain its economic independence, will fight for that country, or for its cultural aspects to be realized in terms of countries which are exposed to cultural imperialism. They were willing to assist such countries and bring about unity on those perspectives and in those dimensions as one. Right, we move on to question number 2.6. Using the information in the relevant sources and your own knowledge, write a paragraph of about 8 lines explaining how the defeat of South African Defense Forces at the Battle of Quito Carnival in Angola led to peaceful negotiations in Southern Africa in the late 1980s. You answer the paragraph question again in Pew method. We have to give a point, which is answering the question. And after giving the point, we have to explain that particular point. And after explaining the point, you also need to give evidence from the sources. And after giving evidence, then you can link back to the line of argument. So in our answer here, our question is asking about the defeat of South Africa in the battle and how did it lead to peaceful negotiations. So in our answer, we are saying, did it have any impact, the defeat of South Africa? Did it impact on peaceful negotiations in Southern Africa? Or it was because of some other reasons, not the defeat of South Africa? That is our answer to the question. So in this instance, we know that South African defeat and its withdrawal and getting to negotiation is the one that prompted the tripartite negotiation and ultimately the transition of Southwestern Africa, which is Namibia, into its independence. So our answer to the question must address that the Battle of Quito Carnival in Angola, it was the South African defeat in the Battle of Quito Carnival that apparently led to peaceful negotiations in Southern Africa. We are crediting that the defeat of South Africa led to peaceful negotiations. It's a point. Then we explain how the defeat of South Africa led to peaceful negotiations. We talk about how South Africa was experiencing the war. South Africa was fighting on the front under the support of the USA. In the Battle of Quito Carnival, South Africa was almost losing its grip because the Angolan forces, together with the Cuban troops, with the help of USSR Air Force, South Africa was unable to drive the Cuban forces. And apparently, South Africa was faced with a critical challenge of almost losing the war, leading them to withdraw from the war. Then we find evidence from the sources. Talk of the tripartite negotiation, the three-party, which is evidenced in that particular source. Talk of South Africa getting to peaceful negotiations in that source. Talk of you pick evidence from the different sources. Then at the end of the paragraph, you link back to the line of argument where you now qualify that whatever you've said in that paragraph is supporting that it was South Africa's defeat which led to those negotiations and peaceful negotiations happening in Southern Africa. Then you are done with your paragraph question. Then quickly we move on to our essay question. We are going to look at essay question number 4, which is the extension of Cold War, a case study in Vietnam. I think with these essay questions, what you need to master most is the skills of answering the essay question. And the points mainly, they are not much difficult to remember, but what is important for you is to be able to respond to the question correctly and give a response which is in line with what the question is demanding, and do not wander around what is not asked in the question. But question number 5 is based on the case, question number 4 rather, we want to start with question number 4, is based on the extension of Cold War, which is a case study for Vietnam. Right, maybe just giving you a brief history of the Vietnam War. Right, the Vietnam War was also one of the proxy wars which was fought in Asia, where America got involved because of what was termed the domino theory. The domino theory, if you still have an understanding of it, right, it was an idea, or it was a proposition that America had. America felt like if one country falls into communism, if one Asian country falls into communism, the rest would follow. That was the domino theory. So because of this idea of the domino theory, the USA wanted to avoid any country from Asia falling under communism, as it would prompt other countries to follow, and it will mean that it will weaken its ideology of capitalism in Asia. So they got involved in Vietnam as a way of stopping or containing the spread of communism. And in this instance also, we are looking at Vietnam, which was divided into South and North Vietnam. And because of that division, there were also two leaders who had differences in their qualities of leadership. But however, that is background information. We must not spend much time on the background information. Otherwise, we will divert our attention from the question. Let's look at the question as it is and figure out how to answer the question, because what is important is for you to know how to answer the question. The background, though, is important, but it's not advisable usually that you dwell much on the background information in the essay, for there are no marks for the background information. It's just there to help you understand how the events unfolded, but however, it's not answering the question. Explain to what extent. This is our question. To what extent? What? The technological superiority of the USA Army. What about the technological superiority? Could not help defeat a small army of Viet Cong guerrillas. And in which time 1962, 1973. Right. So, substantiate your answer with relevant historical evidence. Going back to how our essay questions are structured, we know well that our essay questions, we have three setups of our essay questions, right? Let's start with that one. One, it says to what extent? And the other one would ask you about, do you agree? And the other one will ask you about critical discussion, critically discuss. So you need to know how to address each and every specific question according to how it is phrased in the question. So when you're answering a question which is asking you about an extent, you need to show whether it's to a greater extent or is to a lesser extent. By greater extent, we are saying, or lesser extent, we are saying how far is it confirmed that whatever historical event you are being asked happened in that particular direction. How far is it confirmed that that historical event happened in that direction? If it's fully confirmed, then it's to a greater extent. If there are some doubts, then it's to a lesser extent. And this must be your answer to the question. You must address this because your introduction must have a line of argument or an answer to the question. That is where your answer is. If the question is saying to what extent, by showing the extent, you are answering the question. If you're not showing the extent, it means you are wandering around the question. You are giving relevant information to the question, but you're not answering the question. There is no direct response to the question, or there is no answer to the question. There is need for a direct response or an answer to the question first. Then we will go on to explaining other things. Then we'll go on to the next one, which would be phrased in the direction of do you agree? Right. This one wants you to agree or to disagree. That is your answer to the question. Agree or disagree. And also remember for this one, for the essay, you must not use personal pronoun. Pronoun, which is a personal pronoun, I. You must not use I. So how do you phrase your agreeing or your disagreeing? You can say in agreement or in disagreement. Or one can agree or one can disagree. Or it is agreeable or it is disagreeable. Or this essay agrees or it disagrees. So you find ways of avoiding using the personal pronoun I because it's not allowed for you to use the personal pronoun I agree or I disagree. So you use the third person, not the first person. You use the third person as to show whether you are agreeing or you are disagreeing. That is how you attempt to give the answer to that question. Then we move on and look at a critically discuss. A critical discussion question, what you need to do here, as your answer, you need to approve the statement or you need to disapprove the statement. Approving the statement, you are saying, you are showing that the statement is historically correct. Disapproving, you are showing that the statement is not correct. And this should be based on evidence. Because if you approve a statement and you fail to defend your line of argument, your essay won't be contextualized. Which means you should weigh your points and see whether your argument is biased towards approval of the statement or in disapproval of the statement. Right. So this is the first step. Given that you have those three setup of the questions for the essays, what you also need to note is after addressing the question, you need to answer. You need to, after giving the answer to the question, you also need to give a reason. Give a reason. In this instance, you give a broad reason. This is the because part. This is the second step. After answering, step number 1, then step number 2. You have given your answer to the question, you have provided an answer or a line of argument to the question. Then we want you to substantiate why you have answered the question in that direction. Why have you chosen to approve the statement or to disapprove? Why have you chosen to agree with the statement or to disagree? Why are you saying it's to a larger extent? Or why have you said it's to a lesser extent? We want a general reason that you are going to give for that particular direction that you have taken or for that line of argument that you have opted for. Then step number 3 for introduction. That is where now you give your elaboration or what we also call orientation. On this part of the essay, we are saying, what is the essay going to prove? Going to prove. Or we are saying, what historical evidence are you going to present in the essay? What is the essay all about? What historical evidence are you going to present in the essay? That is the elaboration part. So those are the 3 basic steps of your introduction. Failure of which to address those 3, your introduction won't be contextualized. It needs to be within the context of the question, you're answering the question, and you give a reason why you're answering the question in that direction. And lastly, you give the reader an orientation or a direction of what you are going to present in the essay so that the reader knows what content is going to be presented or what historical content are you going to present in the essay. So going back to our question, let's go back to our question. Right. It says, to what extent? We show an extent. We choose a greater extent. To a greater extent, the technological superiority of the US Army could not help defeat a small army of the Viet Cong guerrillas in the Vietnamese War between 1962 and 1973. That is what you are opting for as the extent. And why have we taken that extent? This is so because despite the superior weapons by the USA, they were humiliated in the Vietnam War by the guerrillas. The guerrillas, despite them having non-conventional fighting methods, they were able to win and unite with North Vietnam under communism. You see our reason here. We are giving a reason to substantiate why we have said the technological superiority of the US could not defeat. Why couldn't they defeat? Their methods were less effective. Despite them being conventional, their methods were less effective. And the Viet Cong, despite their methods being non-conventional, they were very effective and they led them to winning the war. We are giving a reason. Then we go on to an elaboration. We now want to show the reader what we're going to prove in the essay. This essay is going to further elaborate on the conventional strategies that the USA employed against the non-conventional guerrilla tactics by the Viet Cong in the Vietnam War. Your introduction is complete. It has an answer. We have given an extent to a greater extent, and we have explained why we're answering that question in that direction. We have indicated that despite America using conventional methods, they were ineffective, and the Viet Cong having non-conventional guerrilla warfare, they were very effective, leading to their ultimate victory in the war. And lastly, an elaboration this essay is going to further elaborate on the tactics and strategies that were used in America by the USA against the Viet Cong in the Vietnam War. Then the introduction is complete. Then we now go to the answer of the question. We don't want to spend time on background information because our answer is based on the technological superiority of the US and the Viet Cong guerrillas. So our answer should be addressing the side of America's strategies and how they failed against the Viet Cong strategies and how they succeeded in winning that particular war. Right. So I will list some of the tactics and strategies by the USA and just briefly explain some of them so that we don't waste much time. Right. If we check on the side of the USA, remember, it was using conventional fighting methods, which are the non-methods of fighting. That is what we call conventional methods of fighting. The ordinary and the long are the ones which has been used in history of fighting and which are known and which are common. Right. So I will just highlight on the key aspects here. We'll start with Rolling Thunder. And then we can also go to Operation Range Hand. And then we can also maybe go to Safe Village. Then you can also maybe include the My Lai massacre. And also talk of chemical weapons. In this instance, one talk of napalm. And you can also maybe check on other methods that were employed, like you can talk of the search and destroy. Or can talk of other methods that were used, like we can talk of search and destroy. We can talk of sending the young and inexperienced soldiers. Then we got the side of Vietnam, the Viet Cong. We look at their strategies also and their tactics. We can talk of tunnels. We can talk of guerrilla warfare. Then we can also talk of tunnels, guerrilla warfare. We can talk of camouflage. We can talk of support from peasants. We can talk of support from neighboring countries. We can also talk of support that they got from USSR and China. And yeah, there's a lot to say. We can talk of the booby traps. We can talk of the landmines. So you see, if you are able to develop these points into paragraphs, it will mean that you will be having so many paragraphs there because those points, each point should have its own particular paragraph. If you are to follow the peel method of presenting our paragraphs in the essay, each point should have its own paragraph because its point with its explanation, you give on examples, then you provide a linking statement to that particular point. So it means at the end, each and every point will be having its own paragraph, right? So we start with the strategies that were used by the Viet Cong first, because they were the ones who won in the war. But when you are presenting in your essay, You can interchange the strategies. You talk about America, talk about the Viet Cong, talk about America, or you can two of Viet Cong, one of America, two America, three Viet Cong, going like that. Because it's not like you have to exhaust one side, then you go to the other side. It's one essay, and we infuse the points and show how they succeeded and how they failed at the end. Because our line of argument, it says America, despite their superior tactics, or it failed, but against the Viet Cong, which means whatever you are saying in your line of argument, you must show how the Viet Cong strategies succeeded, and you must show how the USA strategies failed. That is our line of argument. Right. So starting from the Viet Cong side, we're going to talk of tunnels. The Viet Cong, they used the tunnels in the war against the Americans. And what was the rationale of the tunnels? The tunnels were supposed to provide them with safety during the war. And in those tunnels, there were kitchens, and also they had medical supplies. And how were the tunnels designed? The length, they had tunnels of up to 250 kilometers. And also those tunnels were smaller enough to accommodate the Viet Cong bodies. Because the Viet Cong, remember, they are Asian, they are slightly smaller than the American average body. So it meant that upon entry, it was only the Viet Cong smaller bodies which would enter into the tunnels, and Americans could not get their bodies fit into the entry of the tunnels. So in the tunnels, they would get medical supplies, where they would get medical attention in case of those casualties, and also they had kitchens where they would be guaranteed of supply of food during the war. So it worked good for them because they were always having supplies of the needed commodities during the fighting phase, and apparently leading to their ultimate win against the American troops. Then we go to guerrilla tactics. You explain. The Viet Cong used guerrilla tactics. What kind of tactics were they? They were hit and run. They were using hit and run tactics. They avoided face-to-face fights. They did not want to face the enemy face-to-face because the American troops were many. They were in large numbers. And they knew well that they would be outnumbered if they would steer, they would have a face-to-face war. So they would attack from hidden angles and would disappear. So how did it assist them? It made the American soldiers so scared because they didn't know who their enemy was and how their enemy was attacking, where their enemy was attacking from, and when was the enemy going to attack. So the American soldiers became so confused in the war and became so scared in the war because of the guerrilla tactics. They would use hit and run, attack and disappear. They were fighting in smaller groups. So when I explain guerrilla warfare, you explain it as a hit and run tactic. And also it was a tactic where they fought in smaller groups. And also they were trying to avoid a direct war with the Americans. So at the end, it assisted them in winning against the Americans because they confused the Americans, and the Americans wouldn't know when, how, and where they would be attacked by their enemy. And worse, they didn't even know who their enemy was. So it worked well for the Viet Cong. You link back to show that it was successful and it assisted them in winning against the tactics and strategies that were employed by the USA. Then you go to camouflaging. Under camouflage, we can explain that they blended with the environment. Remember, they were the up origins of the land where they were fighting. So they were blending with the environment. And also you can talk of them not wearing uniform. They didn't wear uniforms in the war, which made it very difficult for the American soldiers or troops to identify them. One, they are matching well with the environment, with the surroundings. And also, two, they are not in uniform. So it was very difficult for the American troops to identify their enemy. And at the end, it worked for the good of the Viet Cong, leading to their ultimate win in the Vietnam War. We explain it that way. Right. Then we go to the support that they got from peasants. Remember, Vietnam is a farming country. There were peasant farmers who were also actively involved in supporting the guerrillas. And these guerrillas, they were promising them land. If they were to be independent under North Vietnam and combined with North Vietnam, They were promising land to the peasants. Once we get independent, we're going to give you more land for farming. And also they were promising, or they were also assisting them with daily work in the field. The guerrillas, they will be workers, they will be farmers during the day, and they would fight during the night. So they won the hearts of the peasants. The peasants became so actively involved in supporting the guerrillas. And with that support, it also further strengthened their side against the American troops because they had all the support, they would get all the support they needed. In case of casualties, they would get somewhere to shelter themselves. In case of need for food, they would get food from the peasants. So at the end, they were working very close together with the peasants, and also in terms of getting spy information, they would get information from those peasants. So at the end, they became very effective in the war because of the support that they were getting from the peasants. Right. And we got support from neighboring countries. We also remember the Ho Chi Minh Trail. There was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was a passageway which was used to transport supplies from North Vietnam to South Vietnam through the neighboring countries of Cambodia and Laos. So these countries also were very critically important for the Cambodia and Laos. They were very important to the Viet Cong because they gave them all the support that they needed to transport their commodities, either military equipment or some other resources that were needed during the war from the North Vietnam coming into South Vietnam, smuggling them via the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So that support also aided them to strengthen their side and also made them be very effective in the war, leading to their ultimate win in the war because of the relevant support that they were getting from the neighboring countries. Right. Then we also check on the support from USSR and Cuba. Right. USSR, remember, was actively involved in supporting the Viet Cong guerrillas, right, mainly in the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The USA, when it introduced a bombing campaign, they wanted to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail so that there wouldn't be any supplies to the Viet Cong guerrillas. But however, whatever was damaged by the USA, Russia would quickly get into action to replace the damages and also to ensure full functionality of the system, which is beneficial to the Viet Cong guerrillas. So at the end, it became very difficult for American side to destroy the supplies of the Viet Cong and sabotage them of critical supplies because whatever they would destroy, the Russia and China would come into play to restore whatever was damaged. And then we go to the booby traps and the landmines. The guerrillas would plant the booby traps for which if the American soldiers would step on, they would be pierced to death. And also the landmines, they would burst and kill the American soldiers. And also given that the American soldiers were not very familiar with the environment that they were fighting in, they ended up stepping on those traps and also ended up stepping on those landmines. And at the end, they also became very confused on where to walk and where to step. And that led to them being less effective because they were now afraid that they maybe the next move you are stepping on the booby trap or the next move you are stepping on a landmine. Then their mobility was minimized for that sake of fear, and also that made them become less effective in the war, leading to ultimate victory of the guerrillas of the Viet Cong. Right. So basically, those are some of the things that you can elaborate on when you're talking about the Viet Cong side. Then we go to the American side, the USA strategies. Right. If we check, there are so many of them. Why America has got more strategies than the Viet Cong is because the Americans were keeping on changing the strategies in the war. They would try one strategy, it is faced with criticism or it becomes ineffective. Then they would try to bring in another new strategy. And again, it's faced with some challenges. Then the more they tried new strategies, the more they ended up having quite a number of strategies and tactics that they employed in the war. Right, we started with Operation Rolling Thunder. It was an operation which was a mass bombing operation. They were bombing places in Vietnam, and their target mainly, they were claiming that they were targeting the industrial areas and also the military bases. By industrial targets, they were targeting so that they would weaken the Viet Cong. They would weaken their availability of food and availability of basics because they were assuming that maybe they were relying on the industries. So by bombing the industries, they wanted to weaken the side of the Viet Cong guerrillas. And also attacking military bases, they thought the guerrillas were having formal military bases where they would apparently attack them and bomb them from there and destroy them. But however, it was not realistic. The Viet Cong were fighting a guerrilla warfare. They never had such bases. And also, the South Vietnam is more of a farming country. There is less of industrialization there. So at the end, their targeted bombing points went missing, and they ended up just bombing anyhow, recklessly, without hitting any target. And that prompted them to withdraw the strategy again because it was not effective. It was not attaining the intended goal of destroying military bases and of destroying industrial targets. So they had to withdraw Rolling Thunder because of its ineffectiveness. And that shows that the methods were ineffective. It is a conventional method. They are using conventional aircrafts and using non-bombs. But however, they are missing the targets, and apparently they are forced to withdraw that strategy because of its ineffectiveness in achieving the intended goal. Then we go on to Operation Ranch Hand. Unfortunately, I could not arrange them according to their series of their historical series of events or series of happening. But however, we just want to discuss on the tactics so that at least maybe we have an understanding of what was happening in that particular war. Right. So under this one here, we can all talk of the Operation Range Hand, which is another operation which was put in place by America. Right. In that operation there, what were they trying to achieve? What kind of a warfare was it, which was codenamed Operation Range Hand? Right. Operation Range Hand was more of usage of chemicals in the war. Right. There are two chemicals which were used under that operation. There was chemical called Agent Blue and another one called Agent Orange. Those were the two chemicals which were used in that operation, which was codenamed Operation Range Hand. Right, so their target was that because of the situation that they were faced with in the war, they were failing to identify where their enemy was because it was more of a thicket country, a forested country. So they used Agent Orange to destroy the forests. It was a chemical which was sprayed on the forests, which would destroy the forests so that it becomes clear and they will be able to see their enemy from the thicket. But however, if we check on environmental concerns, that made America have a very bad image because of environmental damage. They damaged thousands of hectares of forests for the sake of identifying the guerrillas. And it became an environmental concern to environmentalists across the world, leading to them withdrawing that tactic again because of their image, which was now getting bad for harming the environment. Then they also used Agent Blue. Agent Blue was targeting the crops. They were spraying a chemical which would destroy the crops and also which would make the soil infertile so that they would deprive the guerrillas of food supply. They wanted to weaken them by depriving them of food supply. But however, it did not work again for the same reason of environmental concerns and also for health concerns. It was also known to be causing cancerous infections. And not only amongst the guerrillas and the peasants, and also amongst their own very soldiers, because they were exposed to the chemicals as they were going through the ground fighting. And also with the guerrillas, remember they were giving support from neighboring countries and also from Russia and China, which meant that they kept on having supplies despite them destroying their crops and also trying to weaken their source of food production, which was the soil. But however, the guerrillas kept on fighting despite such attempt by America to use those chemicals, leading to ultimate withdrawal of those chemicals and them having to adopt other strategies outside the ones which they had tried. Then we'll go to the safe village policy, or it's also called the strategic hamlet. What kind of a policy was this one? This one here, their target was to split the citizens or the peasants from the guerrillas. They wanted to ensure that they will put all the citizens or the civilians inside the villages where they will safely stay there. And whoever was out of the village, they knew well that they were supposed to attack such people. Because now, because of the atrocities which were pointed on them killing innocent civilians in the war for failure to identify who the guerrillas were. Now they wanted to find a method of splitting the guerrillas from the villagers. So they took all the villagers into the villages that they created, which they called the strategic hamlets, so that they will be able to differentiate between the guerrillas and the villagers. But however, the guerrillas would also filter into the same villages because the guerrillas were not easy to identify, and also they were ordinary people during the day. They would be going around doing normal farming business around the farms in the day. So they would still filter into the same villages where they were not supposed to be in. And at the end, the Americans, they still failed to identify the guerrillas because they are looking for people. They are thinking that they have split those guerrillas from the ordinary citizens. And yet, amongst those ordinary citizens, the guerrillas are already inside those people. And when they are putting them in the villages, they are also putting together with the guerrillas. So at the end, it did not work because they failed to strategically split the guerrillas from the villagers. And also, it was a concern to the villagers. They were not happy with the strategic village policy. They were removed from their original ancestral lands. They were not happy with that. And also, it prompted them to give more support to the guerrillas because they were not happy with the American strategies of removing them from their ancestral lands. And also, in the villages, they were also not very comfortable in practicing their day-to-day activities, including their religion. They were not having free space to practice their religion, to practice their day-to-day rituals and cultural activities, and also to live their own independent life. They were now they were now like kept in a concentration camp because of the sake of splitting them from the guerrillas. So it also prompted them to give more support to the guerrillas to fight against the enemy who had deprived them of their rights. Then we go on to the My Lai massacre. The My Lai massacre, this one, what was called the My Lai massacre was a village. According to the American maps, they had their maps that they were using in the war. There was a village which was called the My Lai. And there was false information which was spread to them that in in the My Lai village, there were guerrillas who were being sheltered there. And they thought of going to the village and massacre it, destroy whoever was there because they had information that that was the hiding place for the guerrillas. But unfortunately, after killing over 500 people, they only discovered that the number of guerrillas who were positively identified there were 3. And also because that war was the first war to be televised, that led to wild and uncontrollable outcry from the world. For atrocities, America was greatly criticized for being cruel and ruthless in the war, killing innocent civilians in the pretext of finding guerrillas. And at the end, you tend to find that it was only women and children who were in that particular camp. And also, they also did acts of atrocities by raping women in that particular camp before killing them. So because of that, because of that world outcry, America had to apparently reduce its involvement in Vietnam because now the image was getting bad and bad on the global scale. And also, back at home, there were protests against the government by the ordinary citizens of America, protesting against America's involvement in foreign politics of other countries and also in wasteful expenditure and loss of lives in foreign countries. Right, then we go to the chemical weapons. The chemical weapons, we talk about napalm. It was another chemical which was used as a chemical warfare. It was a burning chemical which would stick to the human body and which will burn the flesh to the bone until a person is dead and is nowhere to be found. So again, it was a very cruel fighting method of burning people in the war. And also it led to outcry from countries of the world and led to widespread criticism of America and prompting them to withdraw that tactic. Then we can talk of young and inexperienced soldiers. America also was taking the Vietnam War as an easy war because they knew that Vietnam was a small nation, and also given that they had a mighty militancy, they thought they were just going to crush the Vietnam guerrillas and defeat them. So they sent young and inexperienced soldiers, but unfortunately, those soldiers were massacred in massive numbers. And also that led to mass protests in America. People were now protesting against loss of lives. Those young and inexperienced soldiers, most of them, they died. They sent about 500,000 young soldiers, and almost 3/4 of them died in the war, leading to people back home in America. They were now fighting against the government for taking people for granted and getting people killed in a war which was non-beneficial for the ordinary citizen. So based on that, you can now, maybe you can also add the Tet Offensive on this side of the Viet Cong. They also introduced the Tet Offensive, which was a surprise attack on America-controlled cities. And maybe here you can also add Vietnamization, which is almost the end strategy after President Nixon came into power. The America gradually withdrew from Vietnam and they started training the South Vietnamese army and ensure that it will sustain on its own while they are gradually moving out of the South Vietnam. Then basically you can see we have tried to elaborate on the essay, and our essay has got so many points. If you can raise those many points and be able to elaborate them in, explain them in a pure method and link them back to the line of argument and give as much details and examples as is possible, then your essay will get you a very good level, which will get you a very good grade in the end. So we now go to the conclusion. Given that we've elaborated on the requirements of the essay, the conclusion should be reached based on evidence. It means for this essay, we have gathered enough evidence to convince the reader that the American strategies were ineffective and they failed, and the Vietnam strategies were effective and they succeeded, because we are saying the technological superiority could not help defeat. So whatever we're saying, we were showing that those tactics could not help defeat. And whatever the guerrillas used helped them to win and defeat the Americans. So in conclusion, you tie up your argument, or you can reaffirm the key point without repeating exactly what you said in the presentation. So you can sum up your presentation, like in conclusion, one can strongly agree that the technological superiority of the US Army could not help defeat a small army of Viet Cong guerrillas. The Viet Cong were ultimately able to regain their country and get united with North Vietnam under communist ideology. Or we can conclude by saying the Viet Cong, one can safely conclude that the technological spirit of American army could not help defeat a small army of Viet Cong guerrillas. The Viet Cong, despite them using inferior methods, they were so determined to fight for their own independence. it was more of an ideological war to the Viet Cong than an independent issue. Then you have come to the conclusion of your essay, and your essay would be contextualized, and your conclusion also will be contextualized. Right. So that is basically what you're supposed to do with that essay question. Then also look at the Independent Africa essay, which is a case study for Congo, right? It talks about Mobutu. The question is saying, Mobutu Sese Seko's political, economic, and social and cultural policies, which he introduced in the Congo after gaining independence in the 1960s, were anti-colonial in nature, right? So we're looking at the political, economic, social, and cultural policies. And the question is saying they were anti-colonial in nature. Do you agree? Right. You have to analyze the question before you take a line of argument. Whether you agree with that statement or you disagree, you need to take a careful line of argument. When we are saying something is anti-colonial, we are saying it was against colonial ideas. It was against the ideas of colonialism, and it was against the ideas of the former colonialists. Remember, the Congo was the former colony of Belgium. And it was under King Leopold who took Congo as his own personal property and exploited the resources of Congo, the copper, the rubber, and the diamonds. But however, after attaining independence, Mobutu also took his own stance of governance of the Congo economy. So when we are saying we're anti-colonial, we are saying his ideas of governance, the political ideas, his economic ideas, or his social ideas were more of against the colonial ideas. And the colonial ideas here, we are referring to the former colonialists who were the Belgians. Right. So do we have to agree with the statement or we have to disagree? We know well that what Mobutu was doing, he was apparently trying to challenge Western ideology. Much of the things that he did or he implemented were against Western ideology. So we can safely agree with that statement. So in opening our introduction, like what we have said, when you're answering a do you agree, we have to avoid using a personal pronoun, I agree. You use terms like in agreement, or one can historically agree, or it is agreeable. So for this matter, you can say it is agreeable that Mobutu Sese Seko's political, economic, social, and cultural policies, which he introduced in the Congo after gaining independence, were anti-colonial in nature. Right, then we want a reason. Why are we saying they were anti-colonial? Why have we agreed that his political policies? We can highlight what he did. Mobutu, maybe here, because we have so many aspects to look at. We have to look at political, we look at economic, we look at social, and we look at cultural. Maybe we can highlight on political as a reason to show that he was anti-colonial. Remember, the colonialists, mainly the West, they believe in democracy. How was Mobutu's policy of politics related to democracy? Mobutu believed that democracy was a foreign idea. He did not believe that in Africa we have to uphold democracy. He was believing that Mobutu believed that democracy was a foreign ideology. So why? Because Mobutu widely believed that democracy was a foreign ideology. He implemented a one-party state in Congo, or he became a dictator for the people of Congo. We have dictators, but much of the colonialists, they believe in democracy, and they don't believe in dictatorial leaders and one-party states. So he was anti-colonial in nature because we've given those reasons. He transformed the politics of Congo from a democracy to a one-party state, and he rose to become a dictator for the Congo. Then you elaborate on the line of argument. what are you going to expose, or what are you going to transpose in the essay? What is the essay going to prove? This essay is going to further explain on the political, economic, social, and cultural policies that were introduced by Mobutu. Right. So your introduction is complete. It has got the basic requirements of the introduction. It has an answer to the question. It has a reason, and it has an elaboration or an orientation. What you need from there now is to go into the question and answer the question as it is posed. In this instance, we are saying your question, you are answering the economic, you're answering the political, you're answering the social, you're answering the cultural policies, and show how they were anti-colonial. Right. So as you go through your points, there are so many points to note under political or under economic, under social and cultural. Right. So we can start with maybe under a political. We explain that Mobutu came into power through a coup d'etat. Him coming to power without being elected is apparently anti-colonial in nature. The colonialists, they believe in leaders getting to power through a formal election. But Mobutu defied the norm of being elected and rose to stardom through a coup d'etat. It's political. Then you can also talk of the one-part state. You can also argue on the one-part state, him introducing a one-part state. You can explain the one-part state that he made it compulsory for all people to be part of his one and only political party, and all other political parties were deemed illegal and were supposed not to operate. And also you can talk of paternalism. Paternalism, we are saying people of Congo had no say in decision-making for the country. He did not tolerate any decision-making or any consultation from an ordinary citizen, but rather they were treated like children who would just have to sit and wait for the father to decide for them. So ultimately, the people of Congo were deprived of some form of right which was there for them under the colonial rule. And given that situation, it also meant that the people of Congo were now just not having anything to say against their government or anything to do with to decide on their own future. And also, if you can also check, you can talk of nationalization. It's either economic or political nationalization. Remember, the Belgians were capitalistic. They were believing in private ownership of businesses, but however, when Mobutu came into power, he changed those privately owned businesses into state-owned businesses. And he apparently took them for his own benefit, where he financed his projects using the state funds because of the effect of nationalization. Then you can explain also other policies like kleptocracy, which was a self-enriching policy for him and his immediate family members and friends. By kleptocracy, the people were using state resources for their own benefit, and they were able to become rich because of that exploitation. And also it relates to social aspect of elitism. Elitism, we're saying, he managed to create an elite group amongst the society of Congo, where there was a small group of very rich and pronounced people who had acquired the highest possible education and who were having the highest amount of income in the Congo economy. That was the kleptocracy, the elitism, because of his policies. He managed to create an elite group amongst the people of Congo, which was a group of rich people and affluent people who had control of resources and who became rich and were able to acquire education from abroad. And also, if you can check on nepotism. Mobutu was able to implement nepotism as part of his policies in governing the people of Congo. Nepotism, we are saying, you put your immediate family members on important positions of governance and important positions of business in the economy. So it meant that the Mobutu people and the relatives of him were the ones who were controlling the economy because they were imposed on positions which were critical for the viability of the economy so that they would use the resources for their own benefit and enrich themselves from the Congolese resources. Then besides nepotism, we can also talk of Zairinization. This can be political or economic. Zairinization, that was a policy that he implemented where he removed skilled foreigners from positions and replaced them with the Congo people. You can also explain the impact of Zairinization. It brought in disastrous effects for the people of Congo because these people who were put in positions, they were unskilled and most of them, they were uneducated. They were unable to hold those positions, leading to a critical downfall on the economy of Congo. And also we can talk of policies like Africanization, it's social. Africanization, it involved a number of things. It involved names, changing of names, and also changing of names of people and changing of names of cities and towns and also of the country itself. And also it addressed the dressing code. Right. So under Africanization, Mobutu wanted Zaire to be identified as a pure African nation, which had got unique African attributes, which they were supposed to uphold. So he introduced Africanization and he proposes that people were supposed to change their names. Remember, with colonial ideology, people should adopt names that they want. If you want to identify yourself as Christian, then you can have a Christian name. If you want to identify yourself as any other religion or Muslim, you can have a Muslim name. Or if you want to identify yourself as European, you can have an English name. But however, Mobutu was against that ideology. He was believing that it's a foreign ideology. And he wanted people to be identified as African by African names. So people were supposed to be renamed and be given African names. Those who had Christian names, they were supposed to change. Those who had English names, they were supposed to change to pure African names. And when I'm giving evidence, evidence is of himself. He was named Desire Mobutu and changed his name to Mobutu Sese Seko Wazabanga, what, in that direction, to show that it's a true African name. Then also names of places, the cities in Zaire, in Congo were also renamed to indigenous African names. Like the capital, Kinshasa, it was Elizabethville. It was changed to Kinshasa to show the need to attain an African society. And also, if you check Congo itself, the country, it was also changed from being a Congo to Zaire. That was the official name, which was now being used to refer to Congo. It was now referred to as Zaire to show that it's a typical African country. Then we go to dressing. Dressing also, he had to change the dress code. He did not want people to adopt the Western dress code of suits and ties, but rather they were supposed to give that upper cost the Mao style, the Asian style of dressing. So basically, that was how he introduced Africanization for the people. And also in terms of music, he tried to promote local music and to make people believe in their own African music as a way of identifying themselves as African and not to spend time listening to foreign music. Right. And You can also talk of under that one, besides us talking of Africanization, we can also highlight on other aspects on education, which is part of social. What happened to education? Right, with education, we are saying he was to a large extent anti-colonial, but however, he failed here. French remained the medium of instruction, French language. Remember, the Belgians were using French. So French language remained the medium of instruction in schools, meaning to say the language of teaching and learning was maintained as French in that instance. And also, if you check what did he do to the quality of education, right, you tend to find that he withdrew funding from education and health. Withdrew funding from health and education, and that negatively impacted on the level of education amongst the people of Congo, because parents now, they were supposed to fend for the welfare of their children in terms of education. They were now supposed to provide for the school fees for their own kids after the government withdrew the funding from education. So it was a very negative implication on the people of Congo that the our government withdrew funding from education and healthcare. For they are now supposed to pay for their own healthcare and they were supposed to pay for their education. And also, if we check, he also affected negatively on the payments of civil service. His policies also affected education and healthcare, where teachers went for months without being paid because of the poorly performing economy. And also the nurses and professionals in the health sector, they were also negatively affected for his withdrawal of funding from those institutions and the failure of the economy to raise sufficient funds to take care of the welfare of its own workers. So at the end, we ended up having serious challenges of his policies being anti-colonial in nature. Then we can also talk of his personal cult. Mobutu introduced his personal cult, which was called Mobutuism, a personal cult which was named Mobutuism. Mobutuism, what kind of a cult was it? We are saying with Mobutuism, he was trying to make the people of Congo see him as a mini god for them. He was making people believe in him as a father figure for the state. And also, he wanted people to fully believe that he was the ultimate leader who was given to them by the Creator. So, he created a cult whereby they would praise him in song and in dance in honor of him and in recognition of him, and he would want to seed that mentality amongst even the youths so that they would grow up with the belief that Mobutu was the best leader ever brought to them by the gods. So it was a cult which was also anti-colonialism. You cannot impose cultism on people. It's against, there are no colonialists who want to impose a cult ideology on people, want to make people believe that you are the best ever and you are the one who was made to lead them. Right, so we can also talk of that cult of Mobutuism, and we have talked of Zairenization and we've talked of nationalization. Right, I think those are some of the aspects that we can elaborate on. And also we can talk of reliance on foreign aid. It was also one thing. Reliance on foreign aid. The economy of Congo was more reliant on foreign aid. It was failing to sustain itself. And at the end, it ended up relying on foreign support from the World Bank and other international institutions. So for that sake also, you can critique that Mobutu was even failing to maintain his legacy of anti-colonialism by failing to sustain his own economy and ending up relying on support from multilateral international institutions and support from other countries like the United States of America. Right. Given such, we have just touched on the key aspects of the question and the basic requirements of the question. and also what you were supposed to elaborate on if you are answering that particular question. So basically, that is what we attempt to address. And the other thing is we're not supposed to be misled by the question which is talking about anti-colonial in nature. Because usually that question, when it comes, is phrased upon the successes and failures of Mobutu. But in this instance, it's slightly different. It's talking about anti-colonial. But what you must understand is that anti-colonial just means against colonial ideas. Right. So basically, those are the responses to the question in just brief explanation. So what you need to note there is also you need to bring about a conclusion for that particular essay. You need to have a conclusion which is contextualized, a conclusion which is in line with your line of argument. Remember, we have chosen to agree with that particular statement that the policies were basically anti-colonial in nature. So we must reaffirm that in the conclusion. As we conclude our essay, we should ensure that we try to address the fact that whatever we're saying in the discussion, in our paragraphs of the essay, they were supporting the fact that whatever policy was anti-colonial in nature. So we can conclude the way we conclude our make our conclusions, like we use our indicative terms, like in conclusion, or one can historically conclude that, or it is generally acceptable and undoubtable that the above evidence, or one cannot go against the above evidence that the political and economic policies were anti-colonial. So, like a simple conclusion, it conclusively, Mobutu Seseko's political, economic, and social and cultural policies, which he introduced after independence, were anti-colonial in nature. Then you can provide a summing up conclusion. The fact that he was against the ideology of Western dressing clearly signifies him being against any ideology to do with colonialism. We can conclude saying that we've reaffirmed the fact that he made people to dress in a particular African way. Or we can conclude by reaffirming the fact that he introduced Africanization where people were supposed to change their names into pure African names. So one can conclude that Mobutu's policies, which he introduced after independence in 1960s, were strongly anti-colonial in nature. The fact that Mobutu changed his name as an example to become a more Africanized person clearly resembles that he did not want anything to do with colonialism. Then we can end like that. That is how we contextualize our essay or our conclusion. Or we can reaffirm on the political spectrum by reaffirming with him his perception of the effect of democracy. Mobutu did away with the concept, the political idea of democracy in running the politics of Congo, for he strongly believed that democracy was a foreign idea. We have reaffirmed that he was anti-colonial. He was believing that democracy was anti-colonial, was a foreign idea, so it was part of the colonialist ideas. We must not adopt it. We must have an autocratic state where there's no democracy. So we can safely conclude using those points and reaffirming some of those points as has been indicated in our discussion. So basically, as I'm rating this particular paper, this paper is an average paper where we expect an average learner not to get less than 60% score for this particular paper, because checking on the source-based questions, they are basically fair and they do not have vague language or language which is slightly above the understanding of an average grade 12 learner. The language is at par with the level. So I strongly believe that in this paper, those who have written, those candidates who have who wrote this November 2024 paper, we are going to have pleasing results came January 2025. And also, for those who are going to watch over this presentation, I also want you to get the benefit of what we are discussing here. For the papers, almost the same. Like those who are writing maybe 2025, you can also benefit from this presentation, and you can also correct yourself, and can also maybe learn 2 or 3 things from the presentation, and it can also guide you in how to answer some particular set of questions, like for example, the paragraph questions, the comparison questions, and also how to attempt your essay questions. So basically with history, it is to my strongest belief that history is not a subject to fail, or is not a subject to get a poor grade. It's there to boost your grades, to boost your APS, because the things are basically the same. What you do in term 1, term 2, in term 3, and you get to term 4. If there are essays, paper 1, there are only 3 essays, which means you would have been done with those essays the moment you get to junior examinations. If you want to do all the 3 essays, you repeat them in the prelim examinations, you meet the same essay questions in the final examinations. So the content, I understand, for an average learner, it would have sunk in your mind, such that even if you are maybe just waking up, someone asks you a question on Vietnam, tell me, maybe explain to me 5 strategies that were used in the Vietnam War by the USA. You cannot run out of ideas, even if you're coming from the blankets. Exactly, you can get those ones because they would have sunk in your mind because of repetition. You are doing the same thing over and over, writing the same essay in the SBA in the first term. Maybe you're writing the same essay again for the junior examination. You meet the same essay again in the preliminary examination. Then again in the final examination, you are doing the same content. So there's no reason, or there's no justification for one to score a lower grade in history. Rather, we cannot even talk of failing history, because it's a basic subject that everyone must be comfortable with and must just be able to apply the instructions. The basic thing about history is for you to follow the instructions as per the guide and use those instructions to answer whatever is asked. And the moment you do that, you know you are heading for the best. And there is nothing that can prevent you from attaining the highest possible grade that you would have dreamt of, or that you will dream of in future. So basically, that is what history is all about, and that is what our paper was all about from our final paper, paper 12024, which was written today, the 29th of October 2024. So we'll meet in other discussions to follow. We'll have other discussions for the coming papers. So it is my hope that this presentation has worked to the benefit of those who will watch it and who at least learn a lot from the presentation. Till we meet in other discussions, have a good day.
Yeah.
Good day, learners. Welcome to the memo discussion for History Paper 1, 2024. The national exams, the national senior certificate exams for 2024. I want to go through the paper and try to discuss and figure out the possible responses to the questions that you have just answered on this particular day in the morning session of 29th of October 2024. Right, so I'll quickly go through the paper, and we'll try to figure out the basics of the paper and see how best you were supposed to have responded to those questions. Right, from how it looks, as usual, we know well that we are supposed to be conforming to our instructions, and the setup of our paper does not change, it remains the same. Remember, it's 3 questions for section A, which is source-based questions, and 3 questions for section B, which is the essay questions. And our core focus for question number 1 is the origins of Cold War. We'll be looking at events that unfolded during the onset of the Cold War. And our question number 2 is independent Africa, which is a case study for independent African states, which is our focus for Angola. And then question number 3, the civil society protests in the 1950s and 1970s. Then we go to our question number 4, which is the essay question, which is the extension of Cold War, a case study of a historical event which happened after the Cold War tensions were intensified. Right, we have the extension of Cold War, which is a case study for Vietnam. And also, we have our independent Africa, which is a case study for Congo, that is question number 5, and civil protests from 1950s to the 1970s, which is the Black Power movement. So basically, the setup of the paper, as long as you are still following the same syllabus, you have to know that the setup of the paper is the same, and you have to prepare equally the same for those topics. And in as much as I want also to remind you of the instructions, always remember that you are supposed to answer at least 1 source-based question and 2 essays, or 2 essays and 1 source-based questions. It is never possible for one to answer 3 essays or to answer 3 source-based questions. It's a choice. You can answer at least 1 source and a maximum of 2, and at least 1 essay and a maximum of 2, which means the 3rd question will be the other setup of the question, since you're supposed to answer 3 questions to get a total of 150 marks. Right, as I was browsing through your paper, basically the paper is more or less an average paper, where we expect an average learner to score as high as is possible, because the paper is basically an average to a slightly above average paper. In as much as we cannot say it's an easy paper, the content is basically a basic content, which is understandable and which is to the reach of an average learner. And given that you have been studying throughout the year, and you've also gone through the preliminary exams, they have fully equipped you with the skills. Starting from the junior examination, you went to the preliminary examination, and these are the finals. It means you are now fully equipped with the basic skills of actually answering such typical questions. Right. For the sake of our discussion, let's go to question number 1. Right. Our question number 1. Remember, when you're answering an essay, when answering a source-based question, check the focus of the question. What is the focus of our question? It's saying, how were the lives of Berliners affected by the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961? That is the focus of our source-based question. It focuses on how the lives of the Berliners were affected by the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. Right. So basically, maybe just giving you a brief history, just a reminder of the Berlin Wall. It's just a reminder. We're not concentrating onto the Berlin Wall as a particular historical aspect, because I understand the information we have it and it's at your disposal. You already know about the Berlin Wall. Right. The Berlin Wall was actually built by the East German, the German Democratic Republic, trying to prevent its people from moving from East Berlin going to the West. And why was it so that Berlin was divided into East and West? It was because of the fact that Berlin was supposed to be divided into zones of occupation, which were supposed to be occupied by the 4 superpowers after the Second World War. And on the extreme east, we tend to find that on the east, it was then a zone of occupation of Berlin, which was controlled by the USSR or Russia. Then on the west, we had the 3 superpowers having their zones of occupation there. The zone of occupation for the USA, and another zone of occupation for France, and then the last zone of occupation for the British. And ultimately, we got to discover that those 3 zones of occupation, which were controlled by the capitalistic countries, they later on united them into one zone of occupation, which meant that by that time, by around 1961, Berlin was now divided into two: the East zone of occupation, which was controlled by Russia, and the West, which was a combined zone of America, Britain, and France. And what was happening because of the unfolding of historical events, I think you still remember the Marshall Plan. Because of the Marshall Plan, America was releasing funds to assist war-ravaged countries to recover from the implications of the Second World War. And given that the zone of occupation in the West was a zone of occupation which was controlled by capitalistic countries, it was also a beneficiary of the funds which came from the Marshall Plan. And apparently, they were now able to revive the economy of West Berlin, and the economy thrived. And also because of the combined effort of the three superpowers, they were now able to implement policies which were effective in managing the economies of their zones of occupation and also their territories in West Germany. So as a result, there was a distinction between East Berlin and West Berlin. The Eastern Berlin, because it was still under communism, and remember the USSR was struggling, it was not making it financially and economically. And their people now were exposed to poor living conditions because of the limitations in the financial capacity of their superpower controlling them. So there was a mass exodus of people moving from the East Berlin going to the West, which prompted the East Berlin to construct a wall to block its people from escaping from East going to the West. And remember, it was an ideological war between capitalism and communism. Both the extreme ends, they were trying to make their economic system appear pleasing to the people so that they would be able to influence other countries to follow their ideologies. So in as much as Russia was failing, they did not want also the world to know that their economic system was a failure and their very own people were actually running away or trying to find ways of running away from their own territory. That is why they had to construct a wall to block people escaping from East going to a better economy in the West. And also because of the political systems, the political governance, the government of the German Democratic Republic or the East German, it was a communist government, which was also some communist government, which was a fascist government. It was a dictatorial government which did not respect the humanity, which did not respect human rights. So people were also not happy being governed by a dictatorial and fascist government. That is why they were moving also to the West, where there was democracy under capitalism. So basically, that is the focus of our question. We want to look at how people's lives were affected by the construction of that Berlin Wall, separating East Berlin from West Berlin. Right. We are going to start with question number 1. Right. When, according to the source, did the construction of the Berlin Wall begin? Our focus here on the question, you can see, is saying when. When a question is saying when, it means it's addressing a time factor. We are worried about the time factor here. When it says when, we want to identify the time factor for which that particular historical event happened. So basically, when we're talking of when, we're talking of time, the time factor. And also, if you check the mark allocation, if you check your mark allocation here, this is a 1-by-1 question, which means this is an extraction question. It's extraction, meaning to say the answer is there in the source. What we just need to do is to go to the source and identify the answer. If you come to our source, we tend to find that our source 1A is there. And also, before you attempt questions, also check the context of the question of the source. Try to figure out the heading of the source and identify what the source is about. Like if you check the context of our source here, source 1.8 says, the source below is from an article, Berlin Local Life, written by D. Rhodes in the Travel Guide of 31 March 2015. It explains why the Berlin Wall was constructed in August 1961. That is the context of our source, which means the focus area of our source is explaining why the wall was constructed. Right. So the question is saying when. So we just go to the source. It's an extraction question. if we check here, it says construction on the Berlin Wall began early on the morning of Sunday, 13 August 1961. So when this is where our response is, this happened on, it was on a Sunday, the 13th of August 1961. That is where our response is coming from. So it's an extraction question. We just extract our answer as it is from the source. So the construction, it happened on that particular day and date. Right. Give one reason in the source why the German Democratic Republic, the GDR, constructed the Berlin Wall. Again, if we check, it's a one by one. This is an extraction question again, and we just want to identify one reason, which will also mean that we have to go to our source and identify where we find our response from the source. It's an extraction question, right? It says, if we check there, an effective move by the German Democratic Republic to do what? To stop East Berliners escaping from the Soviet-controlled East Germany into west of the city. That was the reason why they built that particular wall. From what we've been discussing, people were now moving away, were now escaping from east, going to the west. So they built a wall to stop East Berliners escaping from Soviet-controlled East Germany into the west of the city. And the west of the city, remember, we've mentioned that it was controlled by America, Britain, and France. And given the differences in the ideological systems that they were following, they wouldn't be pleased to have their people moving to a different economic system or to a different political ideology. So they were preventing their people from escaping from the east going to the west, which was controlled by the capitalists. Right, we move on to the next question. The next question is a concept, definition of the term. It is much important that whenever we are studying, also start with your key concept, understand the key concept of the topic so that when you are answering questions, you get to be used to the terms and you get to interpret them correctly and understand their meaning. Right. When we talk of communism here, we can define it differently according to different understandings. But what is required is for you to address the basics of the definition. Right. When we're talking of a communism, we can talk of communism as an ideology. An ideology. Or we can talk of communism as an economic system. It's either an ideology or an economic system. And how does it operate, or what are the basis for the function of such an ideology? The ideology basically it believes in collective ownership. Collective ownership meaning to say the government has ultimate control over the state resources and is the one responsible for the distribution of the resources towards its own people. And what is the main aim under communism? The main aim is to attain equality. Equality meaning to say we want to try by all means to reduce the gap between the rich and the poor. So communist ideology is an ideology or an economic system that, yes, is its existence to collective ownership of property and the means of production, or resources are to be shared equally among its citizens in a particular country. And also the other basics is that the government has got ultimate control over the resources. It is the government's duty to distribute the resources, to manage production of goods and services, to manage the resources and to manage production and to manage the distribution of those resources amongst the citizens. That is the basic idea of communism, which is now different from capitalism. If we're looking at the ideology which was followed by America, Britain, and France, their ideology was that of capitalism, which is different from communism. Capitalism now on the other extreme, it does not believe in equitable distribution. It believes in reward for your effort. The more you work, the more you must get. The more you are innovative, the more you must be rewarded. That is a capitalistic ideology. So under capitalism, the belief is that we must have private ownership of the resources or the means of production. They must be owned privately, which means if you are able to do a particular business, you must be allowed to run and operate your own business and make as much profit as is possible.